Get out of my house before I have security. Throw your belongings onto the street. My sister Chloe spat the words at me while the paramedics were still wheeling our father's body out the front door. The marble floors of our childhood mansion felt like ice beneath my feet. My father Marcus, a self-made billionaire who built a logistics empire from scratch, had taken his last breath. I was still wearing the clothes I had slept in beside his hospital bed for the last 3 days. Now my older sister and her husband Trent were standing in the grand foyer blocking the staircase. Trent was swirling a glass of my father's most expensive bourbon, a smug grin plastered across his face. He looked me up and down with disgust. "Come on, Zariah, be reasonable," he said. "You do not belong here anymore. Take your things and leave quietly." "My name is Zariah and I am 33 years old. Before I tell you how this midnight eviction ended with my sister losing everything, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. If you have ever had to stand your ground against toxic family members who tried to tear you down, hit the subscribe button. You are going to love hearing exactly how I made them pay for this night. Growing up in this estate, I was always the invisible one. Chloe was the golden child while I worked 80-hour weeks to keep my father's company afloat. I sacrificed my 20s for our family legacy. Yet here I was, being tossed out like trash the moment the true king was gone. I stared at Trent. This man had married into our family 2 years ago and had contributed absolutely nothing but a sense of unearned superiority. He took another slow sip of the bourbon. The audacity of this man drinking the liquor my father had saved for my future wedding was enough to make my blood boil. Chloe crossed her arms, her designer dress rustling in the quiet hall. "I am the eldest, Zariah. The company and this house belong to me now. Daddy is gone and you are just an employee. I want you out tonight." I took a deep breath, forcing my voice to remain perfectly steady. "Chloe, Daddy has not even been gone an hour. You are seriously doing this right now. We need to plan the funeral." She rolled her eyes and stepped closer to Trent. "Trent handles the business now," she sneered. "You are just holding us back." Trent reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a leather checkbook. He clicked a silver pen and began writing. He tore the check off and held it out to me. "I am writing you a check for $10,000, Trent said, his voice dripping with sympathy. "Listen, Zariah, we know it is tough for a single black woman to make it out there on her own without family support. Use this to rent an apartment downtown, get yourself settled. Maybe find a husband who can take care of you. We just need to professionalize the family business, and we cannot have dead weight dragging down the new corporate vision." I looked at the piece of paper fluttering in his hand. $10,000. He was offering me $10,000 to walk away from a $60 million empire that I had personally saved from bankruptcy 3 times while he was off playing golf. The pure entitlement radiating off him was suffocating. He honestly believed he was doing me a favor. He genuinely thought he was my savior, stepping in to rescue the poor lonely sister with a meager handout. I did not reach for the check. I simply looked him dead in the eye and let the silence stretch. I watched his smug smile falter just a fraction. Then I turned my back on both of them and walked calmly up the grand staircase. "Where do you think you are going?" Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I am giving you 10 minutes to pack your bags or I am calling the police." I did not need 10 minutes. I walked into my bedroom, grabbed the single duffel bag I had packed days ago when the doctors told me the end was near, and walked right back out. I had known this moment was coming. I had prepared for it. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, Trent was still standing there, the check still in his hand. "You are making a huge mistake, Zariah," he warned. "This is the only help you will ever get from us." I walked past him, pulling my coat tightly around my shoulders. I opened the heavy oak front door. The freezing rain was coming down in sheets, washing over the circular driveway where the ambulance had just been. The cold wind bit into my skin, but I felt completely numb to it. I stepped out onto the wet stone porch and stopped. I turned around to face them one last time. They stood together in the warm golden light of the chandelier, looking like the perfect wealthy couple ready to inherit the world. I looked right at my sister. The corners of my mouth curled up into a slow, chilling smile. "I do not need your money, Trent," I said, my voice slicing through the sound of the pouring rain. "And Chloe, before you start picking out new curtains for the living room, I have one question for you." I paused, letting the weight of the moment sink in completely. "Did you actually read his will, Chloe?" I did not wait for her to give me an answer. I turned and walked slowly into the freezing dark rain, leaving the heavy wooden door wide open behind me forever. This was only the beginning of the trap I had carefully laid out just for them. The driveway gravel crunched under my boots as I walked away from the massive colonial house. The freezing rain soaked through my wool coat in seconds, but I did not rush. I walked with the deliberate pace of a woman who had just been handed the keys to her enemy's destruction. My car, an understated black sedan, was parked at the far edge of the estate. It was a stark contrast to Trent's flashy imported sports car sitting right by the front door like a shiny trophy. I unlocked my door and slid into the freezing leather seat. The heavy thud of the car door shutting blocked out the sound of the storm raging outside. I sat in the darkness for a long moment, just listening to the rain pound against the metal roof. The smell of wet wool and the sharp antiseptic scent of my father's hospital room still clung to my clothes. I reached up and adjusted the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of my own reflection. Deep, dark circles weighed down my eyes. I had not slept a full night in weeks. I reached into the passenger seat and unzipped my duffel bag, pulling out my heavy encrypted work laptop. I rested it on my steering wheel and pressed the power button. As the screen flared to life, casting a harsh, cold blue glow across my face, my desktop folders loaded. Right there in the center of the screen was the visual proof of our two entirely different lives. On the left side was a folder labeled Fourth Quarter Risk Analysis, holding thousands of complex spreadsheets I had built during 80-hour work weeks. On the right side, a folder labeled Chloe's Corporate Expenses. I clicked it open just to remind myself of exactly who I was dealing with. Scanned receipts from luxury boutiques in Paris filled the screen. $70,000 charged to the company card for a holistic wellness retreat in the Swiss Alps. $30,000 for a chartered flight to Milan. All while I was pulling all-nighters at the corporate office, surviving on stale coffee and sheer willpower to keep our global supply chain from collapsing under the weight of her reckless spending. My father had allowed it out of a misplaced sense of guilt over her mother's early passing, but I was not my father. I owed her nothing. I plugged a secure secondary drive into the USB port and typed in a 64-character alphanumeric sequence. The standard corporate desktop vanished entirely, replaced by a stark black terminal window. This was my domain. Trent thought he was an absolute genius for locking me out of the main company servers 15 minutes after my father died. My phone had already buzzed with the automated alert informing me my employee credentials had been revoked. Let him think he had won the first round. He was playing a simple game of checkers while I was restructuring the entire board behind his back. I typed a specific command prompt, launching a hidden network protocol I had quietly installed 6 months ago when my father first got sick. I called it Project Phoenix. My fingers flew across the keyboard, the rhythmic clacking filling the quiet cabin of my car. I connected to my secure mobile hotspot, routing my signal through 3 different overseas servers to mask my location. The terminal screen scrolled with rapid lines of green code as I bypassed the main corporate firewall Trent was so proud of updating. It was almost too easy. He had immediately rushed to change the administrative passwords, but he had absolutely no idea that the entire company network was built on a secondary foundation I had engineered from the ground up. I watched the progress bar inch forward on the screen. 50%, 70%, access granted. Now I was deep inside the central nervous system of the logistics empire. I navigated straight to the core asset registry. This was the real beating heart of our $60 million operation. The software that tracked every single delivery truck on the road, the digital leases for all our international warehouses, and the proprietary routing algorithms that made the company so incredibly valuable to outside investors. Trent and Chloe firmly believed they now owned all of this simply because their names were printed on the shiny surface-level corporate documents locked in a safe. I initiated the silent lockdown protocol. I did not shut the actual systems down. That would be far too obvious and would give Trent enough time to call in emergency information technology support to investigate the outage. Instead, I severed the digital tethers linking the operational software to the main corporate entity. I systematically rerouted all administrative control directly to an offshore holding company that only I controlled. To the employees showing up for work tomorrow morning, the computer screens would look perfectly normal. Trucks would still dispatch on time. Client emails would still send. But structurally, the $60 million company my sister thought she just inherited was now bleeding out completely unnoticed. I was quietly transferring every single ounce of intellectual property, every algorithm and every server lease out of their legal jurisdiction. They were about to become the proud owners of a completely empty digital shell holding nothing but liabilities. The heater in my car finally kicked in, blowing warm air across my freezing hands, but I barely felt it. My focus was absolute and razor-sharp. I typed in the final execution command and pressed the enter key with a satisfying crack that echoed in the small space. A small, sleek dialog box materialized in the center of the black screen. The text glowed brightly, illuminating the dark interior of my car and reflecting off my eyes. It read, "Transfer of intellectual property complete. Waiting for manual trigger." I smiled and closed the laptop, plunging the car back into darkness. The morning storm cleared, leaving a sharp, biting cold. I had barely slept, fueled by adrenaline and black coffee, but I dressed with meticulous care. I put on my sharpest charcoal suit and secured my hair into a tight professional bun. If I was cast as the villain in their corporate takeover, I was going to look the part. I drove to logistics headquarters, a gleaming glass and steel high-rise that my father had built from a single warehouse operation. The building stood as a monument to his relentless work ethic, and I felt a pang of grief looking up at his name embossed on the facade. I parked my car and walked through the revolving doors into the expansive marble lobby. The morning rush was in full swing. Hundreds of employees hurried past with coffees, nodding to me with sympathetic smiles. Word of my father's passing had already spread through the corporate grapevine. I approached the security turnstiles and tapped my employee badge against the scanner. I just needed to get up to my office to retrieve some personal physical files before the reading of the will. Instead of the familiar green chime, the reader flashed a harsh red light and emitted a loud mechanical buzz. I frowned and tried again. Red? Buzz. A heavy feeling settled in my stomach as I realized what was happening. "Having some trouble there, Zariah." The loud, arrogant voice echoed across the open lobby. I turned slowly to see Trent descending the grand glass staircase. He was flanked by two large uniformed security guards. Trent was wearing a custom navy suit, looking entirely too pleased with himself for a man whose father-in-law was not even in the ground yet. The bustling lobby began to quiet down as employees noticed the standoff. People slowed their pace, glancing over their shoulders, sensing the rising tension. The low hum of morning chatter faded into an uncomfortable dead silence. Trent stepped up to the turnstile, keeping the glass barrier between us like a shield. "Your access privileges have been permanently revoked," he announced, his voice projecting loudly enough for the entire gathering crowd to hear. Chloe and I reviewed the executive payroll last night. As the new head of operations, I have decided that we are implementing immediate restructuring to trim the fat. I stared at him, keeping my expression entirely neutral, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me upset. "Trimming the fat," I repeated evenly. "Is that what you call firing the only person who actually understands the risk analysis of our international supply chain?" Trent let out a condescending chuckle, adjusting his silk tie with a practiced flick of his wrist. "We are modernizing, Zarya. This is a global enterprise now, not a mom-and-pop shop where we can afford to hand out inflated salaries to unqualified family members just to keep them busy. You had a good run riding your father's coattails, But the adults are in charge now. I will have someone from Human Resources box up the personal items on your desk and mail them to you. You are no longer welcome on these premises." The sheer audacity of his words hung heavily in the air. Unqualified. I had 2 master's degrees and had personally negotiated the international contracts keeping this company afloat, while his only qualification was marrying my gullible sister. I could hear the shocked whispers of the staff behind me. The senior logistics manager's people who had worked side by side with me during crisis after crisis looked absolutely horrified. But Trent reveled in the audience. He was putting on a show to establish his dominance, using me as a sacrificial lamb to strike fear into the rest of the employees. He wanted everyone to know that if the founder's own daughter could be thrown out onto the street, nobody was safe. "Escort her off the property," Trent commanded the 2 guards, gesturing toward me as if I were a vagrant who had wandered in from the cold. The guards stepped forward, looking incredibly uncomfortable. One of them, a man named Marcus, who had known my father for 20 years, refused to make eye contact with me. "Please, Miss Zariah." Marcus muttered softly, his voice strained with genuine regret. "Do not make this harder than it has to be." I nodded to Marcus silently, forgiving him. He was just a man doing his job, trying to feed his own family. "Do not touch me," I said, clearly projecting my voice so Trent could hear every word. "I know the way out." I turned on my heel and began walking toward the revolving doors, my head held high. I did not rush or look down. I let the sharp click of my heels echo against the marble floor, projecting absolute confidence. But as I neared the exit, a sleek black town car pulled up to the front curb. The driver scrambled out to open the rear door, and a man stepped onto the pavement. I recognized him instantly. It was Richard Vance, a ruthless corporate raider from a highly aggressive rival Wall Street firm. My father had despised him for years because of his unethical business tactics. I slowed my pace, blending into arriving employees near the glass facade. Trent rushed out the front doors, bypassing me entirely to greet Richard with an eager handshake. Trent reached into his briefcase and pulled out a red-banded folder. I knew exactly what that folder was. It was our confidential executive portfolio containing the proprietary client lists and internal valuation documents. Trent handed it over to Richard with a greedy smile. My blood ran cold, and then a sharp realization hit me. Chloe had no idea about this secret meeting. Trent was secretly selling the logistics company to our biggest rival before my father's will was even formally read by the lawyer. I watched Trent hand over the confidential portfolio to Richard Vance and felt a sharp, twisted sense of satisfaction. Trent was a fool. He was trying to liquidate a logistics empire he did not even understand, and he was doing it entirely behind my sister's back. Chloe thought she had married a wealthy, brilliant investment banker, but Trent was nothing more than a parasite looking for a quick cash out. I turned away from the glass facade of the building and pulled my coat tighter against the morning chill. I needed a moment to process the sheer magnitude of their stupidity. I walked 2 blocks down the busy downtown street to an upscale cafe I frequented every morning. The warm scent of roasted espresso and fresh pastries hit me the moment I pushed through the heavy glass doors, providing a brief illusion of comfort. I stepped up to the marble counter and ordered a double-shot espresso. The barista, a friendly college student who knew my usual order, smiled and tapped the screen. "That will be $6.50, he said cheerfully. I reached into my designer purse and pulled out my titanium Family Reserve credit card. It was a card tied directly to the main family trust account. I tapped it against the reader and waited for the familiar approved beep. Instead, the machine emitted a harsh, sharp chirp. The screen flashed red with the word "declined." The barista frowned and tapped the machine. "That is weird," he mumbled. "Let us try inserting the chip." I slid the heavy metal card into the slot. The machine processed for 3 excruciatingly long seconds before flashing the red declined message a second time. A line of impatient commuters was beginning to form behind me. I could feel their eyes boring into my back. A wealthy-looking woman in a camel coat let out a loud, irritated sigh. My face flushed with sudden heat. I pulled out my phone and quickly opened my primary banking application. The screen loaded and my stomach instantly dropped. Every single account listed under the family trust was grayed out. My checking account, my emergency savings, my investment portfolios, all of them displayed a balance of absolute zero with a bright red locked icon next to my name. It took my brain exactly 2 seconds to realize what Chloe had done. While my father was in a coma during his final days, Chloe had pressured his medical team into granting her emergency medical and financial power of attorney. She claimed it was just to pay his immediate hospital bills. But the moment his heart stopped beating last night, she had immediately weaponized that legal document to freeze every single joint account tied to my social security number. She was trying to starve me out. She wanted me completely broke, desperate, and crawling back to her on my hands and knees to beg for that $10,000 pity check. I smiled tightly at the barista. "Keep the coffee," I said smoothly, turning on my heel and walking out of the cafe before anyone could say another word. The cold air hit my face again, but the chill was nothing compared to the ice running through my veins. As I stepped onto the busy sidewalk, my cell phone began to vibrate violently in my hand. The caller identification displayed the name Helen. She was my father's second wife, my stepmother, and the ultimate enabler of Chloe's toxic behavior. Helen had spent the last 20 years kissing up to Chloe to secure her own comfortable position in the family hierarchy. I swiped the green button and pressed the phone to my ear. "Zariah, what is wrong with you?" Helen shrieked, her voice piercing my eardrum. "I just got a call from Trent. He said you caused a massive scene in the corporate lobby this morning and forced security to throw you out. Have you lost your mind? Your father is not even buried yet, and you are out here embarrassing this family in front of the entire staff." I kept my walking pace steady, dodging pedestrians, as I headed back toward my car. "I did not cause a scene, Helen. Trent ambushed me at the security gate and fired me in front of 50 employees. He locked me out of the building." "Well, maybe you deserved it," Helen snapped back without a single ounce of hesitation. "You have always been so headstrong and difficult, Zariah. You never knew your place. Trent is the man of the family now. He is stepping up to take care of the business and to take care of Chloe. You should be supporting him, not challenging his authority. You need to turn around, go back to that office, and apologize to your brother-in-law immediately. If you just show some submission and respect, maybe he will allow you to keep a minor desk job so you do not end up living on the streets." The sheer level of misogynoir and internalized patriarchy in her voice was sickening. Helen genuinely believed that because Trent was a white man in a tailored suit, he was automatically entitled to rule over the empire my black father had built with his bare hands. She expected me, a highly educated risk analyst, to bow my head and serve a man who was actively tearing our legacy apart. "Helen, listen to me very carefully," I said, stopping at the corner of the street and lowering my voice into a dangerous whisper. "Trent is not the man of anything. He is a glorified thief. And as for my place, I know exactly where my place is. You and Chloe are about to find out the hard way that you backed the wrong horse. Do not call this number again." I pulled the phone away from my ear, ignoring her frantic squawking, and hit the red end call button. I stood there on the busy street corner, watching the city move around me. They thought they had me completely cornered. They thought cutting off my access to the family trust would leave me helpless. They had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. I unlocked my phone and bypassed my normal banking applications entirely. I swiped over to a hidden encrypted folder and opened a custom financial portal I had built myself. It connected directly to the offshore accounts of Phoenix Holdings, the shell company my father and I had secretly established. The screen displayed a staggering balance in the hundreds of millions safely hidden from Chloe's power of attorney and Trent's greedy reach. I navigated to the transfer menu, selected my secure private checking account, and typed in the number 5 followed by 6 zeros. I pressed confirm. The screen pulsed green, displaying the message $5 million successfully transferred. Available balance updated. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, a genuine smile finally reaching my eyes. Let them have their little power trip today, because tomorrow the real war begins. The next afternoon, the sky was heavy with thick gray clouds, perfectly matching the somber mood of the massive church parking lot. It was time for the repast, the traditional family gathering held just before the official funeral service. My father's church was one of the largest black congregations in the city, and the fellowship hall was packed with hundreds of people. The air was thick with the rich, comforting smells of fried chicken, baked macaroni and cheese, and collard greens. Normally, a repast is a beautiful celebration of life, a time for the community to wrap their arms around the grieving family. But as I walked through the double doors of the fellowship hall alone, I knew there would be no comfort waiting for me here. I smoothed down the skirt of my black dress and made my way through the crowded room, nodding politely to the older church members who offered their quiet condolences. My destination was the private family suite at the front of the hall. It was a secluded room where the immediate family was supposed to gather to pray and support each other before facing the public crowd. I reached for the brass handle of the heavy wooden door, but before my fingers could even brush the metal, a hand shot out and blocked my path. It was my Aunt Viv, my father's older sister. She was wearing a massive black church hat, adorned with stiff netting that partially veiled her face, but there was no hiding the sheer disdain in her eyes. Aunt Viv had always resented my father for his massive financial success, and she projected all of that bitter resentment directly onto me because I was the one who helped him run the empire. "This room is for grieving family. Only Zariah," she said, her voice sharp and loud enough to draw the attention of several people standing nearby. "Aunt Viv," I said, keeping my tone completely even. "I am his daughter. Step aside, please." She did not budge an inch. Instead, she crossed her arms over her chest and looked me up and down with an expression of pure disgust. "Are you really his daughter?" she hissed. "Because I watched you at the hospital for 3 days, and I did not see a single tear fall from your eyes." When his heart monitor flatlined, Chloe was on the floor weeping like a proper daughter should. "You just stood there staring at the machines like a cold, unloving robot. You do not get to come in here and pretend to be part of this family now when you could not even be bothered to cry for your own father." I stared at her, feeling a familiar exhaustion wash over me. I wanted to tell her the truth. I wanted to scream that the reason I did not cry at the hospital was because I was too busy coordinating with the chief of surgery, handling the massive medical bills, and fighting off corporate vultures who were already circling our company the moment news of his coma leaked. I was the one making the agonizing medical decisions, while Chloe was busy taking perfectly angled photos of her holding his hand for her social media followers. I had to be the strong one because everyone else in the room was entirely useless. But I knew explaining any of this to Aunt Viv was a complete waste of breath. She did not want the truth. She wanted a villain to blame, and I was the easiest target. "Fine," I said, my voice dropping to a low, chilling pitch. "Keep your VIP room, Aunt Viv. Just remember who paid for the new roof on this church you are standing in." I turned my back on her, leaving her sputtering in absolute shock, and walked toward the far back corner of the sprawling fellowship hall. I grabbed a small styrofoam cup of black coffee from the beverage station and found an empty folding chair near the coat racks. From this vantage point, I had a perfect view of the entire room. I sat quietly in the shadows, blending into the background, and watched the disgusting spectacle unfold. The private family room doors swung open, and out walked Trent. He was not grieving. He was practically glowing. He moved through the crowd of black mourners with the slick, polished ease of a politician on the campaign trail. He was treating my father's repast like a prime networking event. I watched in absolute disgust as he approached a group of my father's oldest investors and business partners. He was shaking hands, clapping men on the shoulder, and leaning in to whisper in their ears. He was actively handing out his own sleek silver business cards right next to the memorial floral arrangements. The white savior complex was on full display. He was working the room subtly, assuring all the wealthy stakeholders that the chaotic urban company my father built was finally under safe, civilized management now that a real Wall Street mind was in charge. He caught the eye of Richard Vance, the rival buyer I had seen him with that morning. They shared a brief knowing nod across the room. Trent was finalizing the illegal sale of our company over plates of potato salad and dinner rolls. It was a level of disrespect, so profound it actually made me smile. They were all so blinded by their own arrogance and greed that they could not see the massive trap I had already set right beneath their feet. I took a slow sip of my bitter coffee, letting the dark liquid burn the back of my throat. Suddenly, the heavy entrance doors of the fellowship hall opened. The room seemed to quiet down slightly as Mr. Sterling, our longtime family lawyer, walked in. He was a tall, distinguished older gentleman who had been my father's most trusted legal advisor for over 3 decades. He carried his signature leather briefcase and wore a solemn expression. He paused at the entrance, scanning the crowded room. Chloe immediately spotted him and waved frantically from the front of the hall, eager to suck up to the man holding the keys to the kingdom. But Mr. Sterling did not walk toward Chloe. He adjusted his glasses and began walking down the side aisle, moving deliberately toward the back of the room, where I was sitting in the shadows. He did not look directly at me. He kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, walking with a steady, measured pace. As he passed by my folding chair, he did not break his stride for even a fraction of a second, but his hand dipped slightly and he dropped a small, neatly folded white cocktail napkin directly onto my lap. I kept my eyes on Trent, who was still busy laughing with an investor across the room. I slowly uncrossed my legs and placed my hand over the napkin, feeling the rough texture of the paper against my skin. Mr. Sterling continued walking all the way to the front of the hall to greet Chloe and the rest of the family, acting as if nothing had happened. I casually looked down and unfolded the small square of paper. Written in the center with a crisp black fountain pen were exactly 4 words that made my heart race with absolute triumph. They took the bait. I crumpled the small white napkin in my hand, feeling a surge of pure adrenaline wash away the exhaustion of the past 3 days. They took the bait. Those 4 simple words from Mr. Sterling meant that Trent and Chloe had swallowed my carefully constructed illusion whole. I slipped the napkin into my purse and stood up from my folding chair in the back of the fellowship hall. It was time to move into the main sanctuary for the official funeral service. The heavy wooden doors opened, and the massive congregation began to file into the grand cathedral. The church was an architectural marvel, with high vaulted ceilings and beautiful stained glass windows that bathed the pews in colorful light. I walked down the center aisle, keeping my eyes fixed on the massive mahogany casket draped in white roses at the altar. I approached the roped-off VIP section at the very front where the immediate family was supposed to sit. A young usher wearing a stiff black suit stepped into my path and held up a white-gloved hand. "I am sorry, Zariah," he whispered, looking incredibly guilty. "Your stepmother gave strict instructions. You are seated in row 4. I looked past his shoulder. The front row was entirely occupied by Helen Chloe Trent and a few of Trent's wealthy business associates who had never even met my father. The second and third rows were filled with distant cousins who only called when they needed money and enablers who had always catered to Chloe's dramatic whims. They were deliberately pushing me to the back, forcing me to sit behind people who barely knew the man in the casket. A week ago, this blatant disrespect would have broken my heart. Today, it just fueled my quiet, burning fire. I gave the young usher a polite nod. "It is fine," I told him softly. I took my seat in the 4th row, sliding in next to an elderly woman who used to babysit me. From this distance, I had a perfect view of my sister's ridiculous performance. Chloe was draped in a custom runway-style black dress, featuring a dramatic, sweeping veil that looked like it belonged in a fashion magazine editorial rather than a funeral. Local news cameras were positioned at the back of the church recording the service, and Chloe was making absolute sure they captured her good side. She was weeping loudly, dabbing her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief and clinging to Trent's arm. The service began with a powerful rendition of Amazing Grace from the massive church choir. Their voices soared, echoing off the high stone walls. It was beautiful, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to close my eyes and truly grieve the man who had raised me. He had his flaws, and he had definitely made mistakes with Chloe, but he had taught me everything I knew about survival. The music faded, and the head pastor stepped up to the pulpit. He delivered a moving prayer, but then he stepped aside to introduce the man delivering the main eulogy. It should have been me. I was the one who worked alongside my father for a decade. Instead, Trent stood up, adjusting his expensive suit jacket, and strode confidently to the front of the church. Trent stood behind the polished wooden podium, looking out over the sea of mostly black faces, with an expression of manufactured solemnity. He tapped the microphone and cleared his throat. "We are gathered here today to mourn the passing of Marcus, an ambitious man who built something truly remarkable out of nothing." Trent began, his voice booming through the sound system. But as he continued speaking, the tone of his eulogy rapidly shifted from respectful remembrance to a blatant, arrogant public relations pitch. He completely glossed over my father's struggles fighting against systemic racism to secure his first bank loans. He erased the decades of grueling manual labor my father endured driving his own trucks when he could not afford to hire drivers. Instead, Trent painted my father as a lucky pioneer who simply stumbled into a lucrative industry and desperately needed someone to organize his chaotic efforts. Marcus had raw urban hustle, Trent said, gripping the edges of the podium. He built an urban empire fueled by passion and street smarts. But as we look toward the horizon, we must recognize that passion alone cannot sustain a modern global enterprise. It is my great honor to step into his shoes and guide this family business into a more civilized corporate era. We will refine his raw vision and bring true Wall Street sophistication to this company. A collective, uncomfortable murmur rippled through the front half of the congregation. The older church members shifted in their pews, offended by the blatant microaggressions dripping from every single word. Civilized corporate era, urban hustle. He was standing over my father's dead body and calling him an unrefined street hustler who needed a white savior to swoop in and rescue his company from its own success. I dug my fingernails into my palms until they ached. Trent was completely erasing my father's brilliant mathematical mind and my own decade of relentless corporate structuring, all to stroke his own massive ego for the wealthy investors sitting in the front row. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my heart rate to steady. Let him talk, I reminded myself. Let him dig his own grave as deep as he possibly can. Just as Trent raised his hands to deliver his grand concluding remarks, I felt a sharp vibration in my black leather purse. I waited a moment, keeping my head bowed as if I were overcome with emotion. I slowly unclasped the purse and slipped my cell phone out, resting it flat on my lap, hidden beneath the program. The screen lit up with a secure encrypted notification. It was a text message from David, the lead software engineer who had helped me build Project Phoenix. David was one of the few people at the company who was entirely loyal to me. I unlocked the screen using my thumbprint. The text message consisted of exactly 2 sentences, but they hit me like a jolt of pure electricity. Trent just initiated the sale of the core logistics fleet to Richard Vance. He wants it legally finalized before the will is read tomorrow morning. I stared at the glowing screen as Trent stepped down from the podium to the sound of polite, scattered applause. Trent was accelerating his timeline. He was terrified that my father's will might have some restrictive clause regarding the sale of company assets, so he was trying to liquidate the physical trucks and warehouses right under Chloe's nose before the lawyer could officially read the document. He thought he was outsmarting everyone, but he did not realize that the logistics fleet he was desperately trying to sell was completely worthless without the proprietary routing software I had already stripped away. He was not selling an empire. He was selling a fleet of empty metal boxes. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my purse, a cold, calculating smile spreading across my face. Play your little game, Trent. Tomorrow morning you are going to learn exactly what my urban hustle looks like. The silent drive to Oakwood Cemetery was a blur of sleek black cars cutting through the heavy gray afternoon. The rain had stopped, but the damp chill remained hanging over the manicured green lawns and towering marble headstones. I stood near the back of the crowd as the polished wooden casket was lowered into the earth. The pastor spoke his final words, committing my father to the ground. People threw handfuls of dirt and single white roses onto the casket. Helen wailed theatrically, leaning heavily against Trent, who looked like he was already mentally counting the money from the upcoming sale. I did not cry. My morning had been done in the quiet hum of the hospital room, holding my father's hand when it mattered most. I turned away before the service officially ended, wanting to beat the rush of fake sympathies and empty condolences from distant relatives. I walked down the stone path toward where I had parked my car. I was halfway down the winding cemetery road when I heard the sharp, frantic clicking of designer heels striking the pavement behind me. "Zariah, wait right there." It was Chloe. I stopped and slowly turned around. She was marching toward me, her ridiculous dramatic veil flipped back over her expensive hat. Her face was flushed, not with grief, but with a strange, manic kind of triumph. Trent was nowhere in sight, probably off confirming the details of his corporate treason with Richard Vance. Before I could even ask what she wanted, Chloe closed the distance between us and aggressively shoved a folded piece of white paper directly into my chest. "Take it," she snapped. I caught the paper before it fell to the wet ground. I unfolded it slowly, keeping my eyes locked on her face. It was a formal legal document stamped by a county judge. A temporary restraining order. "You are completely out of your mind," I said, my voice dangerously calm as I scanned the legal jargon. According to this piece of paper, I was legally barred from coming within 500 feet of the family mansion or the corporate headquarters. She had cited emotional distress and a fabricated threat of violence, claiming I had become erratic and dangerous since our father's passing. "You made a massive scene at the office this morning," Chloe said, crossing her arms defensively. "Trent told me everything. You were screaming at the guards and refusing to leave. I will not have my peace disrupted during my period of mourning. You are a toxic presence, Zariah, and I will not allow you to ruin the legacy Daddy left me. You need to stay away from my house and my company." "Your company," I repeated, letting the words hang in the freezing air. "You do not even know what the company does, Chloe. You could not name 3 of our top international clients if your life depended on it. You have never stepped foot in one of our distribution centers." She scoffed, waving her diamond-ringed hand dismissively. "I do not need to know the boring details. That is what we hire people for. Trent is managing the transition perfectly. In fact, he is restructuring the assets as we speak to free up some immediate liquid capital." I felt a sharp internal jolt of amusement. She actually believed Trent was liquidating assets for her benefit. She had no idea he was selling off the logistics fleet to cover his own massive gambling debts right under her nose. "Once the will is officially read tomorrow morning, I am taking a much-needed break," Chloe continued, her voice dripping with pure arrogance. "Trent and I have decided that I need time to heal from this immense trauma. I am booking a 6-month European tour, Paris, Milan, the Amalfi Coast. I am flying first class all the way. It is what Daddy would have wanted for his little girl." I stared at her, trying to fathom the sheer depth of her delusion. "And exactly how are you funding this 6-month healing journey?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. She smiled, a cruel, greedy smile that twisted her perfectly made-up face. "The company emergency reserve fund, of course. There is over $12 million sitting in that account. Trent said we can pull from it as soon as the legal transfer is complete tomorrow. Consider it my severance package for having to deal with you for the last 30 years. She was planning to raid the corporate emergency reserves, the very funds I had meticulously built and protected to ensure our truck drivers had health insurance and our warehouse workers got their holiday bonuses. She was going to drain it dry to buy designer handbags in Italy. A younger version of me would have screamed at her. I would have tried to reason with her, begged her to understand the devastating consequences of bankrupting the family business. But the woman standing in the cemetery today felt nothing but cold, hard clarity. Let her run toward the cliff. Let her jump. I looked down at the restraining order in my hands. I carefully folded it precisely in half and then in half again. I looked back up at my sister and let a genuine warm smile spread across my face. It was the first time I had smiled at her in years, and it visibly unnerved her. She took a tiny step back, her confidence finally faltering for just a fraction of a single second, revealing her hidden fear. "Enjoy the vacation, Chloe," I said, my voice soft and steady, as I slipped the folded paper into my coat pocket. "Make sure you book a one-way ticket." I left the cemetery behind me, the gray headstones fading into the heavy fog. I drove straight through the city, avoiding main highways to make sure I was not being followed. Trent was a desperate man, and desperate men often hired investigators to tie up loose ends. I navigated through winding back roads until I reached the industrial district. I pulled into the empty parking lot of a rundown diner, sitting on the desolate outskirts of town. It was the kind of greasy spoon establishment my sister Chloe would never be caught dead in, which made it the perfect meeting spot for tonight. The flickering neon sign buzzed loudly above the entrance, casting a harsh red glow across the wet pavement. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet car, collecting my thoughts before stepping out into the biting wind. I walked inside, pulling my coat collar up against the chill. The diner smelled heavily of burnt coffee and old frying oil. It was empty except for a lone, tired waitress wiping down the front counter and a solitary figure sitting in the darkest back corner booth. It was Mr. Sterling. He had traded his tailored funeral suit for a thick gray trench coat and a dark fedora, looking every bit like a man carrying highly dangerous corporate secrets. I walked past the empty tables and slid into the cracked red vinyl booth across from him. He pushed a steaming heavy ceramic mug of black coffee across the scratched table toward me. "You played your part perfectly at the service today, Zariah," he said, his voice low and incredibly steady. I wrapped my freezing fingers around the hot mug, taking a slow sip of the bitter dark liquid. "It was not very hard to play the victim when my own family is so remarkably eager to treat me like one," I replied flatly. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the legal document Chloe had shoved into my chest at the gravesite. I unfolded the restraining order and slid the crisp white paper across the sticky table. Mr. Sterling picked it up and scanned the dense legal jargon with his sharp, trained eyes. A dry, humorless chuckle escaped his lips, echoing quietly in the empty booth. "She always did have a massive flair for unnecessary dramatics," he muttered, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. "She is legally barring you from the corporate headquarters, assuming you would try to sabotage her grand inheritance." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, my eyes locking with his. "She is completely blind, Mr. Sterling. She thinks Trent is liquidating the company emergency reserves just so she can go on a luxurious 6-month European vacation to heal from her grief. She actually believes he is managing the transition to help her build a bigger empire." Mr. Sterling set the paper down, and his expression grew incredibly serious. It was the exact same calculating look he used to give my father, right before they went into a ruthless boardroom battle. "Trent is not helping anyone but himself, Zariah," he said, leaning in closer, so his voice would not carry. "And the situation we are dealing with is far worse than we originally anticipated." I listened carefully as the veteran lawyer began to lay out the full, terrifying scope of my brother-in-law's betrayal. I knew Trent was a greedy, entitled parasite, but I always assumed he was just an opportunistic corporate shark looking for an easy ride. Mr. Sterling opened his worn leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of redacted financial documents. "I have been tracking his private offshore accounts for the last 3 months." Mr. Sterling explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "Trent is not the wealthy, successful investment banker he pretends to be. He was quietly let go from his prestigious Wall Street firm over a year ago for gross negligence and misappropriation of funds. He has been living entirely off your sister's company credit cards while aggressively projecting the fake image of a financial genius." I stared at the papers, my mind racing to process the deception. Then why is he rushing to sell the entire logistics fleet to Richard Vance? I asked, trying to connect the dots. If he just wants to live off the family wealth, he could milk our corporate accounts for years without raising suspicion. He cannot wait years, Mr. Sterling replied, tapping a specific column of red numbers on the top page. Trent has accumulated a massive illegal offshore gambling debt. He owes over $15 million to some very dangerous underground syndicates. They called his massive debt in last week right around the exact time your father went into the coma. That is precisely why Trent is accelerating the corporate sale. He desperately needs $15 million in untraceable liquid cash immediately just to save his own life. The final pieces of the ugly puzzle slammed into place with sickening clarity. Trent was not just stealing our family company, he was preparing to burn it straight to the ground to cover his own pathetic, degenerate mistakes. He was using my father's legacy as a giant casino chip to pay off violent criminals. He plans to finalize the handshake sale with Richard Vance tomorrow morning, right before the official reading of the will. Mr. Sterling continued outlining the grim timeline. He convinced Chloe to sign over temporary executive operational control, citing her severe emotional distress from the funeral. She signed away her only legal leverage without even bothering to read the fine print. Once Richard Vance wires the money for the truck fleet, Trent will take his $15 million cut and completely disappear, leaving Chloe holding an empty corporate shell and a massive mountain of angry, unpaid logistics workers. I felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. I did not care about my sister losing her luxury shopping funds, but I deeply cared about the hundreds of hardworking employees who relied on our business to feed their families and pay their mortgages. Trent was completely willing to destroy all of those innocent lives just to save his own miserable skin. He thought he had outsmarted a brilliant self-made black billionaire and his highly educated daughter. He truly believed his white privilege and his tailored suits made him entirely untouchable. "He is going to be in for a very rude awakening tomorrow morning," I said, leaning back in the vinyl booth with absolute certainty. I already initiated the silent lockdown protocol from my car this afternoon. The intellectual property is fully secure. The massive logistics fleet he is trying to sell is nothing but useless pieces of metal without my proprietary software to route them. By the time Richard Vance realizes he just bought a completely dead system, Trent will be permanently trapped in his own web of fraud. Mr. Sterling allowed a slow, proud smile to spread across his weathered face. "Your father always said you were the only person in the world who truly understood the brutal art of corporate war, Zariah. He knew Chloe would eventually run the company into the ground with her spending, but he never anticipated a desperate predator like Trent trying to swallow it whole in one bite. That is exactly why your father trusted you to hold the ultimate legal fail-safe." Mr. Sterling reached back into his leather briefcase one final time. He pulled out a thick, heavy black folder. The edges were sealed, and it carried a weight of immense power. Printed in crisp silver letters across the front of the dark cover were the words, "Phoenix Holdings." He slid the black folder slowly across the table until it touched my hands. The diner around us seemed to fall completely silent. Mr. Sterling looked at me with a fierce, burning loyalty in his eyes. "Are you ready to pull the plug, Madam CEO?" I looked down at the black folder resting between my hands. "Yes, I am ready," I told Mr. Sterling. "Let them have their little celebration tonight. By tomorrow morning, there will be nothing left to celebrate." I paid for our coffees and walked back out into the cold night air, feeling more powerful than I had in my entire life. 24 hours before the official reading of my father's will, the executive suite at our corporate headquarters was buzzing with sickening excitement. I was not there in person, of course. Chloe had made sure her ridiculous restraining order was enforced by the building's security guards, but she and Trent had completely forgotten one crucial detail. I designed the entire internal security network for that building. I was sitting comfortably on my living room sofa holding a warm cup of herbal tea, watching a live high-definition video feed of the main boardroom directly on my laptop screen. The boardroom was lavishly decorated for the occasion. Trent had ordered expensive catered food and several cases of vintage champagne. Chloe was parading around the room in a white designer suit, looking more like she was hosting a charity gala than mourning the very recent death of our father. Trent stood at the head of the massive mahogany table looking incredibly smug. The board of directors, mostly older men who had always dismissed my vital contributions as merely administrative duties, were laughing loudly at his terrible jokes. And sitting right next to Trent was Richard Vance, the rival buyer. Trent raised his crystal champagne flute to quiet the room. "Gentlemen, and my beautiful wife," he began, projecting his voice with practiced false confidence. "Today marks the dawn of a bright new era. We are officially streamlining our operations and shedding the dead weight of the past." Richard Vance stood up and clinked his glass against Trent's. Vance was a ruthless corporate vulture who had been trying to buy our truck fleet for a decade, but my father always shut him down. Now Trent was handing him our most valuable physical assets on a silver platter for a fraction of their true worth, just to secure the quick $15 million he desperately needed to pay off his illegal gambling debts. "It is a real shame Zariah could not be here to see this historic transition," Trent said, with a mocking, exaggerated sigh. "I guess she is too busy looking for a cheap studio apartment downtown." The room erupted into polite, agreeable laughter. Chloe chimed in, swirling her expensive champagne. "Oh, please do not even mention her name, Trent. She is completely unstable. I had to get a restraining order just to keep her from having a total meltdown in the lobby. She never understood the vision of this company anyway. She was just a glorified spreadsheet reader Daddy kept around out of pity because she could not find a husband." I took a slow sip of my tea, watching them congratulate each other on their brilliant theft. They were finalizing a handshake deal to sell a massive fleet of vehicles that were about to become completely immobilized. Richard Vance pulled a thick legal contract out of his leather briefcase and slid it across the polished table. Trent pulled out his expensive silver pen, the exact same pen he had used to write that insulting $10,000 pity check for me. He signed his name with a dramatic flourish, legally binding the sale of the physical trucks. They shook hands, sealing the fraudulent deal while the board members clapped. They thought they had won the war. They thought they had outsmarted the black sheep of the family. Chloe threw her arms around Trent, kissing his cheek and loudly proclaiming him the ultimate savior of the family business. It was the absolute perfect moment to send them a little message from the supposed dead weight. I set my teacup down on the glass coffee table and placed my fingers lightly over the keyboard of my encrypted laptop. I accessed the internal audiovisual controls for the executive boardroom. Trent was still talking loudly, boasting to Vance about his grand plans for a massive European expansion using the leftover corporate funds. I typed in a specific command line, entirely overriding the local manual controls inside the room. I took a deep breath and hit the enter key. Inside the boardroom, the lively classical music playing over the ceiling speakers abruptly cut out. The room immediately fell into a confused, awkward silence. Then the heavy motorized blackout blinds on the floor-to-ceiling windows automatically rolled down, plunging the entire room into total darkness. Trent frowned, looking around the dark space in obvious confusion. "What is going on?" he demanded, angrily snapping his fingers at a junior assistant standing near the door. "Turn the lights back on right now." Before the terrified assistant could even move toward the wall, Switch, the massive digital projector screen at the far end of the room, suddenly hummed to life. The bright, glaring white light illuminated their shocked faces in the dark room. There was no corporate presentation. There were no financial charts or graphs displaying projected revenue. Instead, a stark, blood-red countdown clock appeared on the screen, taking up the entire wall. The giant digital numbers were ticking down second by second. 10 hours, 45 minutes, and 12 seconds. It was ticking down to the exact scheduled time of the official will reading. Trent dropped his champagne glass, shattering it across the beautiful, expensive floor. Chloe grabbed his arm in panic as the red numbers pulsed rhythmically, matching the terrified beating of their own hearts. They stared at the screen, completely paralyzed by the silent threat looming over them. They finally realized that the game was not over. The real nightmare had just begun. I leaned back against the cushions of my sofa, smiling. Tomorrow they would lose everything they ever cared about in this entire world. The sun rose on the 72nd hour since my father took his last breath. It was the morning of the official reading of the will. I dressed in a tailored crimson suit, a deliberate departure from the morning black I had worn for the last 3 days. Crimson was the color of power, and today I was stepping into my full authority. I drove to the logistics headquarters, feeling an incredible sense of calm. The crisp morning air matched the sharp clarity in my mind. When I pulled into the executive parking lot, Trent's flashy sports car was already parked in my father's reserved space. I parked my modest sedan right next to it, turned off the engine, and walked toward the towering glass doors of the building. The lobby was completely silent as I walked through. The front desk security guard saw me approach and immediately tensed up, remembering the dramatic confrontation from the day before. The head guard stepped forward, holding up his hands defensively. "Miss Zariah," he started, his voice shaking slightly. "We have strict orders from Mr. Trent not to let you into the building. There is an active restraining order." I did not break my stride. I looked right through him and kept walking toward the private executive elevator. "I am here for a legally mandated proceeding conducted by the family attorney," I said clearly. "If Trent wants to have me arrested for attending the reading of my own father's, we'll tell him to call the police right now and explain it to the local press." The guard hesitated, lowering his hands, and I stepped into the elevator alone, pressing the button for the top floor. The doors slid open, revealing the expansive reception area of the executive suite. The heavy mahogany doors of the main boardroom were closed, but I could hear the muffled sounds of excited chatter coming from inside. I placed my hands flat against the polished wood and pushed the doors wide open. The room fell dead silent the moment I stepped over the threshold. The scene was perfectly set. Chloe was sitting at the head of the massive table wearing another ridiculous designer outfit, looking completely triumphant. Trent stood right behind her, resting his hands on her shoulders like a king, surveying his conquered land. My stepmother Helen was seated to their right, dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue. At the far end of the table sat Mr. Sterling, his worn leather briefcase resting in front of him. "What are you doing here?" Trent demanded, his face instantly turning a deep shade of red. He pointed an accusatory finger at me across the long table. "Security was supposed to keep you out. You are violating a legal court order, Zariah. Leave this room immediately before I call the police and have you dragged out in handcuffs." I walked slowly to the only empty chair left in the room, directly across from Chloe, and pulled it out. I sat down, crossing my legs and resting my hands on the table. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat loudly, drawing the complete attention of everyone in the room. "Trent, you will sit down and remain quiet," Mr. Sterling commanded, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "Zariah is a named party in these legal documents. By state law, her presence is required for the reading of the primary will. The temporary civil order does not supersede a probate mandate. If you attempt to remove her, I will immediately suspend these proceedings and freeze all assets indefinitely." Trent clenched his jaw so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter, but he slowly lowered his hand and sat down next to my sister. Chloe glared at me with pure hatred, but remained silent. Helen shifted uncomfortably in her leather chair. I looked up at the massive projector screen at the end of the room. It was blank now, but I knew the memory of the ticking red clock from last night was still entirely fresh in their minds. Trent looked exhausted, with deep dark circles under his eyes, proving he had not slept a single wink. He was desperate for this inheritance to be finalized so he could finally pay off his dangerous underground gambling debts. Mr. Sterling unlocked his heavy briefcase with a loud, sharp click. He pulled out a thick stack of crisp legal documents bound by a dark blue ribbon. He adjusted his reading glasses and looked around the room, making sure he had absolute silence. "We are gathered here today to execute the final wishes of Marcus T." He began, his voice solemn and steady. "I will now read the primary distribution of his estate." The tension in the room was so incredibly thick you could cut it with a knife. Trent leaned forward, gripping the edge of the mahogany table. Chloe held her breath, her eyes wide with greedy anticipation. Mr. Sterling read through the standard legal preamble, which felt like it took hours. Finally, he reached the core assets. "To my eldest daughter, Chloe, I leave the entirety of my shares in the Logistics Corporation, granting her 100% ownership and full operational control." Mr. Sterling read clearly. "I also leave to Chloe the primary family residence and the entire balance of the corporate financial accounts currently valued at just over $60 million. A loud, obnoxious squeal of absolute delight erupted from Chloe's mouth. She threw her arms up in the air, completely forgetting her fake morning routine. Helen clapped her hands together, praising loudly. Trent let out a massive, heavy breath of relief, slumping back into his chair. The dark, looming cloud of his $15 million debt had just been permanently lifted. He was officially the husband of a corporate chief executive officer, holding $60 million in liquid cash. He had won the ultimate jackpot. They had successfully stolen my father's entire life work right out from under me. Mr. Sterling continued reading, distributing a few minor sentimental items to distant relatives. But my name was completely absent from the primary asset list. I sat perfectly still, my face a carefully constructed mask of utter defeat. I let my shoulders slump forward just a fraction. I looked down at my hands, playing the role of the devastated younger sister who had just lost everything she had ever worked for. Trent watched me with a vicious, predatory smile spreading across his face. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out the exact same leather checkbook he had held in the grand foyer 3 nights ago. He opened it, tore out the pre-written check, and flicked his wrist. The piece of paper slid smoothly across the polished mahogany table, stopping right in front of me. I looked down at the crisp, handwritten numbers. $10,000. Trent leaned across the table, his blue eyes burning with arrogant triumph. "Take it, Zariah," he whispered, his voice dripping with pure venom. "It is the last handout you will ever get." I looked down at the piece of paper resting on the polished wood. $10,000. A pathetic bribe meant to buy my silence and completely erase my decade of blood, sweat, and tears. Trent was leaning back in his leather chair, his arms crossed over his chest, waiting for me to break down. He wanted me to cry. He wanted me to beg. He wanted to watch me swallow my pride and accept his insulting crumbs. He genuinely believed that stripping away my financial security would force me into submission. But Chloe was not quite finished twisting the knife. She reached into her oversized designer tote bag and pulled out a thick stack of stapled documents. She slapped them down onto the table right next to the check. As my first official act as the sole owner and chief executive officer of this corporation, Chloe announced, her voice loud and grating, "I am formally terminating your employment, Zariah, effective immediately." She flipped to the second page, pointing an acrylic fingernail at a highlighted paragraph. "And just so we are completely clear, you will not be receiving any corporate severance package. Given your hostile behavior in the lobby yesterday and the active restraining order I currently hold against you, I am firing you with cause. I am citing severe insubordination and creating a hostile work environment. You are entitled to absolutely nothing. You immediately lose your corporate health insurance, your company car, and your access to the employee retirement fund. Any unvested stock options you thought you had are officially voided as of this exact minute." Helen nodded approvingly from her seat, patting Chloe's arm with a proud smile. "You are making the right choice, sweetheart." Helen cooed, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "A real leader has to make tough decisions to protect the company from toxic influences." Zariah brought this entirely upon herself. If she had just learned to respect your new authority and show some basic family loyalty, maybe we could have found a small administrative role for her down in the basement, sorting the mail. Trent tapped the face of his expensive silver watch, looking annoyed by the delay. Let us wrap this up, Chloe, he urged impatiently. We have a meeting at the bank in exactly 1 hour to officially transfer the executive operational funds into our private accounts. Richard Vance is also waiting for my call to finalize the logistics fleet sale. We do not have time to waste arguing with disgruntled former employees who refuse to accept reality. We have a massive global enterprise to run. Chloe picked up her heavy gold pen. She signed the termination paperwork with dramatic flair, pressing so hard the ink almost bled through the heavy paper. She pushed the signed legal documents across the smooth mahogany surface toward me. Sign the acknowledgement, Zariah, she demanded. Sign it, take your little check, and get out of my building. I want you entirely out of my life by noon today. Go find a cheap apartment and figure out how to survive in the real world like everybody else. The entire room watched me. The few board members present held their breath, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. They all expected a massive dramatic explosion. They expected me to yell or throw the papers across the room. I did not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I remained perfectly seated, keeping my posture incredibly straight and my expression entirely neutral. I reached out with slow, deliberate movements. I bypassed the termination papers entirely and picked up the $10,000 check Trent had so graciously written. I held the crisp paper up to the light, catching the reflection of the crystal chandelier above us. I looked right into Trent's arrogant blue eyes. I did not blink. I gripped the edges of the check and slowly pulled my hands apart. The sharp sound of tearing paper echoed loudly in the dead-silent mahogany boardroom. Trent's smug smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, utter confusion. I placed the two torn halves together and tore them again. I continued tearing the heavy paper into smaller and smaller pieces until it was nothing but a handful of useless confetti. I opened my fingers and let the tiny pieces flutter down onto the shiny surface of the expensive table covering her termination papers in a blanket of shredded garbage. No one spoke. The sheer disrespect of my silent action completely paralyzed them. I did not need to shout to establish my dominance. My absolute calm in the face of their supposed ultimate victory completely unnerved them. Chloe opened her mouth to yell something nasty, but she could not find the words. Trent gripped the padded arms of his chair, his knuckles turning bright white as his face flushed red with sudden anger. "You are completely insane," Chloe finally whispered, her voice shaking slightly as she stared at the shredded check. I ignored her completely. I slowly turned my head and locked eyes with Mr. Sterling, who had been sitting quietly at the far end of the long table watching the entire spectacle unfold with his hands neatly folded. He gave me the slightest, almost imperceptible nod of his head. The trap was now fully set. The bait had been completely swallowed. They had legally fired me, severing my employment contract and triggering the exact protective clauses I needed. It was time to spring the heavy steel jaws shut. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat. The low, gravelly sound was incredibly loud in the tense, quiet room. Everyone snapped their heads toward him, expecting him to reprimand me for destroying the financial document. Instead, he slowly reached back into his worn leather briefcase. He did not pull out another copy of the termination papers. He pulled out a thick manila envelope sealed tightly with dark red wax. He broke the heavy wax seal with his thumb and pulled out a fresh stack of legal documents printed on thick premium paper. "That concludes the reading of the primary will," Mr. Sterling announced, his voice suddenly taking on a much sharper, more commanding tone. "However, there is one final critical matter we must address before any corporate assets can be legally transferred, sold, or liquidated by anyone in this room." Trent frowned, leaning forward over the table aggressively. "What are you talking about, Sterling?" Trent demanded, his voice rising in panic. "You just read the document. Chloe inherits everything. The reading is completely over. I have a bank transfer scheduled." Mr. Sterling adjusted his reading glasses and looked directly at Trent with cold, brutal professional detachment. Not quite, Trent, Mr. Sterling replied firmly. Now moving on to the addendum executed exactly 1 year prior to Marcus T's death regarding a blind trust. The words blind trust hung in the heavy air of the boardroom. Trent lowered himself into his chair, his eyes darting between Mr. Sterling and the envelope. A blind trust. Trent repeated, his voice losing its arrogant edge. What blind trust? Marcus never mentioned any blind trust to me. We went over the entire corporate structure together just last month. Mr. Sterling did not bother looking up from the documents. Your father-in-law did not consult you on matters of corporate security, Trent. 12 months ago, Marcus foresaw vulnerabilities within his logistics empire. He recognized certain individuals might dismantle his legacy for personal gain. Therefore, he initiated a comprehensive internal restructuring program. I will now read the binding terms of that restructuring. Chloe scoffed, waving her diamond-ringed hand. It does not matter. I own 100% of the shares and the $60 million accounts. A trust fund for some distant relatives is not going to change my executive authority. Read it quickly so we can leave. Mr. Sterling adjusted his reading glasses. I assure you, Chloe, this changes absolutely everything. He cleared his throat again and began to read from the thick stack of premium paper. Effective immediately upon the signing of this addendum, the primary corporate entity known as Marcus T. Logistics is hereby legally separated from its foundational assets. In order to protect the legacy of my life's work, I, Marcus acting as sole owner and majority shareholder, authorize the complete transfer of all intellectual property. Trent frowned, leaning forward over the polished wood. Intellectual property? What does he mean by that? We just run a massive fleet of delivery trucks. Mr. Sterling continued reading, ignoring the interruption completely. This transfer includes, but is not limited to, the proprietary routing algorithms, the global tracking software, the automated dispatch network, and the complete encrypted client database. All of these core digital assets were legally sold and transferred in their entirety to an independent external holding company. A heavy, uncomfortable silence descended upon the boardroom. The board members exchanged nervous, panicked glances. Richard Vance, the rival buyer who had been sitting quietly next to Trent, suddenly sat up perfectly straight. Vance was a ruthless businessman, and he immediately recognized the terrifying legal jargon Mr. Sterling was reading. Wait a minute, Vance interrupted, his voice sharp and demanding. Are you telling me that the company Chloe just inherited does not actually own the routing software that makes the delivery trucks run? That is precisely what I am telling you, Mr. Vance. Mr. Sterling replied calmly. The primary corporate entity merely licenses the software on a strict month-to-month basis from the external holding company. Furthermore, the addendum continues. Mr. Sterling flipped to the second page. I, Marcus, also authorize the complete transfer of all physical master leases. This includes the commercial leases for all 140 international distribution warehouses and the direct titles to the entire commercial transport fleet. Trent's face drained of all color. He looked like he had just been punched directly in the stomach. He reached out and grabbed the edge of the large mahogany table, his knuckles turning completely white. No, that is absolutely impossible. Trent stammered, his voice cracking with sudden terror. I just signed the binding legal paperwork with Richard today. We are selling that entire fleet. We own those trucks. They belong to us. Mr. Sterling looked at Trent with a mixture of deep pity and absolute disdain. You do not own a single truck, Trent. You own a corporate shell that rents the trucks. You cannot sell physical assets you do not legally possess. Attempting to do so is textbook corporate fraud. Richard Vance slammed his fist onto the table. The loud crack echoed through the quiet room. Are you kidding me? Vance yelled, glaring at Trent with pure murderous rage. You tried to sell me a $60 million fleet of empty metal boxes that you do not even own. You are playing dangerous games with my money, Trent. I will bury you for this. Trent held up his hands, desperately trying to calm the enraged billionaire. Richard, please just wait a second. There has to be a mistake. Sterling is lying. He is trying to protect Zariah. Chloe owns the company. Chloe owns the $60 million. Mr. Sterling flipped to the third and final page of the addendum. The $60 million currently sitting in the corporate accounts is not profit, Mr. Sterling stated coldly, cutting through the rising panic in the room. Those funds are entirely earmarked for massive operational liabilities. You owe employee payroll, you owe international taxes, and most importantly, you owe massive monthly licensing fees to the holding company. If you fail to pay those exorbitant fees, the holding company has the legal right to instantly revoke your software access and repossess the entire logistics fleet. Chloe was hyperventilating now. Her perfect, carefully applied makeup was beginning to crack under the sheer weight of her rapidly escalating panic. She looked around the room, her eyes wide and terrified. "Okay, fine," Chloe gasped, gripping the arms of her leather chair so hard her fingers turned white. "Fine. We will just buy the assets back. We will buy this holding company outright now. Who owns it? What is the exact name of the company?" Mr. Sterling ran his finger down the final paragraph of the highly confidential legal document. The external entity that purchased the intellectual property, the fleet leases, and the physical land beneath both the corporate headquarters and the primary family residence for the sum of exactly $1 is legally registered under the name Phoenix Holdings. The name hung in the dead air like a physical weight. Phoenix Holdings. The company that now controlled their entire miserable existence. Chloe shot up from her heavy chair, slamming her hands down onto the shredded pieces of the $10,000 check. "Who the hell owns Phoenix Holdings?" she screamed. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back. The scraping sound of the wooden legs against the floor was the only noise in the room. Chloe was breathing heavily, her chest heaving as she glared at Mr. Sterling, waiting for him to answer her desperate question. She did not even look at me. To her, I was just the defeated younger sister who had already lost the game. She was entirely focused on finding the invisible enemy who had just stolen her $60 million victory. I reached into my leather tote bag resting on the floor beside me. My movements were deliberately slow and completely unhurried. I pulled out a heavy-bound folder embossed with the official gold seal of the state corporate registry. I held it in my hands for a brief moment, feeling the immense weight of the power it contained. Then I tossed the folder onto the center of the mahogany table. It landed with a heavy, solid thud right next to the shredded pieces of Trent's pathetic $10,000 check. "I own Phoenix Holdings," I said, my voice perfectly calm and carrying across the massive room. "I am the sole shareholder, the president, and the chief executive officer." The silence that followed my declaration was absolute and suffocating. Chloe slowly turned her head to look at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and sheer horror. Trent stared at the gold seal on the folder, his mouth hanging slightly open, as his brain struggled to process the reality of my words. Helen gasped, covering her mouth with her manicured hand. The older board members who had laughed at me just last night sat perfectly still, too terrified to make a single sound. Richard Vance narrowed his eyes, looking back and forth between me and Trent, finally realizing the massive scale of the deception he had almost walked right into. "You are lying," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. "Daddy would never do that. He would never give you control over my inheritance." I rested my hands flat on the polished wood, leaning forward slightly to command the space. "He did not give me control over your inheritance, Chloe. He gave you exactly what you always wanted. You wanted the shiny surface. You wanted the fancy titles, the massive corporate bank accounts, and the beautiful mansion to show off to your wealthy friends. And he gave all of that to you. He let you have the entire $60 million corporate shell, but he knew you would destroy his legacy the moment he was gone. He knew Trent was an opportunistic parasite who would bleed this company dry to fund his own pathetic failures. So my father and I spent the last 12 months quietly extracting the actual beating heart of this empire to keep it safe from both of you." I tapped my fingernail against the state registry folder. "I own the proprietary software you use to track every single delivery. I own the digital algorithms that route your trucks. I own the master leases to every single international warehouse you operate. I own the deed to the land this very building sits on, and I own the deed to the land beneath the family mansion you are currently living in. I looked directly into her terrified eyes, letting the absolute truth of her situation sink in completely. You own the cars, Chloe, but I own the engines. You own the house, but I own the dirt it is built on. It is built. Trent suddenly slammed his hands onto the table, leaning aggressively toward me. "This is illegal!" he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "You manipulated a dying man into signing over his assets. We will take you to court. We will tie this up in litigation for the next 10 years, Zariah. You will never see a single dime of that money." I did not flinch. I just smiled. "You cannot afford to take me to court, Trent. You cannot afford to do anything. Your $15 million gambling debt is due right now, and you just lost your only source of funding." I watched the blood drain completely from his face as I casually mentioned his secret underground debt in front of the entire board of directors and Richard Vance. Trent stumbled backward, hitting his legs against his chair. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for the ground to rush up and crush him. Chloe looked frantically at her husband. "What gambling debt?" she shrieked, grabbing his arm. "Trent, what is she talking about?" Trent could not even look at her. He stared blankly at the wall, completely paralyzed by his impending ruin. Richard Vance stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He pointed a thick, threatening finger directly at Trent. "You tried to use my money to cover your degenerate gambling mistakes," Vance growled, his voice echoing with dangerous promises. "You lied to my face and tried to sell me stolen goods. I am pulling my offer immediately, and I promise you, Trent, my lawyers will be the least of your problems when those underground creditors come looking for their cash." Vance grabbed his leather briefcase and stormed out of the mahogany doors, leaving Trent completely isolated and exposed. Helen sat frozen in her seat, her perfectly styled hair suddenly looking completely ridiculous in the face of absolute financial ruin. She had spent 2 decades kissing up to Chloe, assuming it was her permanent ticket to a life of endless luxury. Now she was staring at the undeniable fact that she had aligned herself with a sinking ship. She looked at me with wide, pleading eyes, silently begging for the mercy she had viciously denied me just yesterday on the phone. I gave her a cold, blank stare, offering absolutely nothing. I walked slowly around the edge of the massive mahogany table, my heels clicking sharply against the floor. Every eye in the room followed my movements. I stopped right behind Chloe's chair, looking down at her trembling shoulders. "You thought you were so incredibly smart," I whispered, leaning down so only she and Trent could hear the full weight of my disgust. "You thought walking around in designer clothes and throwing my dedication in my face made you superior, but you never understood the basic mechanics of power. You only understood the illusion of it. My father built a fortress and he handed you the keys to the front door, but he gave me the entire foundation. But I was not finished. The trap still had one final mechanism left to snap shut." I reached across the table and picked up the termination paperwork Chloe had so gleefully signed just 10 minutes ago. I held up the pages, showing her aggressive signature inked heavily at the bottom. "You were in such a massive rush to get rid of me today," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, chilling tone. "You wanted to humiliate me. You wanted to strip away my corporate health insurance and throw me out onto the street without a severance package. You did not even bother to read the employment contract you were officially terminating." Mr. Sterling adjusted his glasses and opened a new folder, pulling out a copy of my original employment agreement. According to the foundational operating agreement between Marcus T. Logistics and Phoenix Holdings, Mr. Sterling read aloud, "Zaria retains complete immunity from termination by the primary corporate shell. Her employment is considered a vital structural necessity for the continued licensing of the proprietary logistics software." Chloe stared at the lawyer, her hands shaking violently. "What does that mean?" she demanded, her voice shrill and desperate. "It means you fell right into the trap," I answered for him, tossing her signed termination papers back onto the table. By legally firing me without cause and signing that document, as the chief executive officer, you just triggered a catastrophic hidden breach of contract clause. You broke the fundamental agreement that allows your company to function. And because of your arrogant, impulsive decision, Phoenix Holdings now has the legal right to instantly revoke your software licenses and demand immediate repayment of all outstanding corporate debts. You did not just fire me, Chloe. You just signed the execution order for your own company. Chloe stared at the termination papers as the reality of her colossal mistake penetrated her skull. Mr. Sterling placed his hand over the documents. "The paperwork is fully executed, Chloe," he stated. "There's absolutely no legal way of ever reversing this permanent action." I opened my black leather tote bag again and pulled out my encrypted laptop. I set it down on the table right in front of my sister and opened the lid. The screen glowed brightly, illuminating the terrified faces of everyone remaining in the room. Richard Vance paused near the mahogany doors and slowly walked back toward the table. His eyes were fixed intensely on my screen. I typed a command into my terminal window, syncing my laptop to the massive digital monitors covering the boardroom walls. The walls suddenly lit up, displaying the live operational map of Marcus T. Logistics. Thousands of green dots moved across the map representing our entire international fleet. It was the visual heartbeat of the $60 million empire. The board members now sat sweating nervously. "Because you breached the foundational operating agreement," I said, hovering over the Enter key. "Phoenix Holdings is exercising its right to revoke all software licenses." I pressed the key. The loud, sharp sound echoed in the silent room. Instantly, the massive monitors on the walls shifted. A jarring red warning banner flashed across every single screen. "System offline. License revoked." The green dots turned gray and stopped moving. The automated dispatch network shut down. The global tracking system blacked out. The client database locked itself behind a digital firewall. In 10 seconds, the entire global network was completely paralyzed. The boardroom phones began to ring simultaneously in a chaotic symphony. International warehouse managers were calling in absolute panic because their doors had digitally locked and their routing software had completely vanished. Chloe stared at the dead screens. She inherited a global empire and destroyed it in less than 10 minutes. Trent looked like he was about to vomit. The company he desperately relied on to pay off his $15 million gambling debt was now a completely worthless shell. His arrogant, confident facade evaporated entirely, leaving him completely exposed. But I was not finished dismantling their entire lives. I closed my laptop with a satisfying snap. As the chief executive officer of Phoenix Holdings, I have another piece of official business to conduct, I announced, looking directly at Chloe and Trent. Since the primary corporate shell no longer has a functioning business model, I am officially reevaluating our tenant agreements. Effective immediately, the monthly rent for this corporate headquarters building is being increased by 500%. Helen let out a loud gasp, clutching her pearl necklace. "You cannot do that," she cried, her voice shrill and desperate. "That is absolute extortion, Zariah." I ignored my stepmother completely and kept my eyes locked on my sister. Furthermore, the land lease for the primary family residence where you are currently living is also being increased by 500%. Both of these massive payments are due in full by the end of this business week. If you fail to produce the funds, Phoenix Holdings will begin immediate eviction proceedings on both properties. You will lose this corporate tower and you will lose the luxury mansion. You will have absolutely nowhere left to hide from your debts. The sheer financial brutality of my words crushed whatever remaining hope they had. They were drowning in a massive ocean of debt, and I had just tied an incredibly heavy anvil to their feet. Richard Vance stood at the edge of the table, his face a mask of cold corporate fury. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out the thick legal contract Trent had so happily signed just last night in this very room. The contract guaranteeing the sale of the physical truck fleet. Vance held the document up in the air for everyone to see. "You tried to sell me a massive fleet of dead trucks," Vance growled, his voice vibrating with dangerous anger. You tried to take my money knowing you did not own the vital software required to make those vehicles move. You actually thought you could play me for a complete fool, Trent. Vance gripped the top of the contract and ripped it cleanly down the middle. He placed the two halves together and ripped them again, letting the pieces fall onto the floor like garbage. He leaned across the table, pointing a thick, aggressive finger directly at Trent's face. This handshake deal is officially dead, Vance announced. And Trent, you are a dead man walking. My legal team is going to sue you for attempted corporate fraud and blatant breach of contract. We are going to freeze whatever miserable personal assets you have left in your bank accounts. But honestly, Trent, the lawyers are going to be the absolute least of your worries. When those dangerous underground creditors realize you cannot pay them their $15 million, they are not going to serve you with formal civil court papers. They are going to break both of your legs. Vance turned on his heel and stormed out of the boardroom, the heavy mahogany doors slamming shut behind him with a loud, echoing boom. The room fell into a terrifying silence, broken only by the continuous frantic ringing of the desk phones. The warehouse managers were still desperately calling, trying to understand why their entire global network had suddenly died. Trent collapsed into his leather chair, burying his face in his hands. He began to sob, a pathetic, wet sound that filled the room. His tailored suit and his arrogant privilege could not save him from the massive hole he had dug for himself. Chloe sat completely frozen, staring blankly at the torn pieces of the contract scattered on the floor. She had always desperately wanted to be the undisputed queen of the massive empire. Now she was the queen of absolutely nothing. The dead silence in the boardroom was finally broken by the sound of Chloe's ragged breathing. She slowly lifted her head from the torn pieces of paper on the floor and looked up at the massive digital monitors. The red warning banners were still flashing across the screens, a glaring reminder of her monumental failure. She looked back down at the legal documents sitting on the mahogany table. The $60 million she thought she owned was entirely spoken for. It was not liquid cash she could spend on European vacations or designer wardrobes. It was a massive pool of money legally reserved to pay international taxes, employee pensions, and the exorbitant software licensing fees I had just permanently revoked. By firing me, she had triggered the immediate acceleration of all corporate liabilities. The $60 million empire she had celebrated inheriting just 10 minutes ago was now a $60 million financial grave. Chloe turned her chair toward her husband. She reached out with trembling hands, desperately seeking the comfort and protection he had promised her. Trent, what do we do? She whispered, her voice fragile and broken. You are a financial expert. You know how to fix this. Tell me how we fix this right now. We can call the bank. Trent did not reach back to hold her hands. He physically recoiled from her as if she were suddenly infected with a deadly disease. He pushed his heavy leather chair back, scraping it violently against the polished floor to put as much distance between them as possible. The slick, polished Wall Street facade he had carefully maintained for the last 2 years completely disintegrated right in front of my eyes. He was no longer the arrogant savior of the family business. He was a terrified, desperate man staring down the barrel of a $15 million underground debt with absolutely no way to pay it. Fix this! Trent yelled, his voice cracking with pure hysterical panic. Are you entirely out of your mind, Chloe? There is absolutely no fixing this. You just destroyed the only leverage we had. Chloe recoiled, her eyes widening in shock at his aggressive tone. But you told me to fire her! She cried out, pointing a shaking finger at me. You handed me the pen to sign the termination papers, Trent. You told me it was the right thing to do to establish my total authority. Do not you dare blame this catastrophic stupidity on me! Trent roared, slamming his hand down on the mahogany table so hard the remaining champagne glasses rattled. You are the chief executive officer, Chloe. You are the one who aggressively signed a legally binding document without even bothering to read the foundational operating agreement first. You were so incredibly desperate to humiliate your little sister that you blinded yourself to the most basic principles of corporate management. You literally handed her the remote control to blow up your own company. I sat perfectly still watching the magnificent implosion of their toxic marriage. Helen stood up from her chair, her face flushed with maternal outrage. "Do not speak to my daughter that way, Trent," Helen scolded, stepping toward him with her hands on her hips. "She is your wife. You are supposed to protect her. We need to stick together to fight Zariah." Trent whipped his head around and glared at Helen with absolute disgust. "Shut up, Helen," he snapped viciously, his face turning a dark shade of purple. "Shut your mouth right now. You are just as delusional as she is. There is no family. There is no empire. There is just a massive mountain of debt, and you two arrogant fools are sitting right at the very top of it, waiting to be crushed. I only married into this miserable family because Marcus had a $60 million cash flow. I tolerated your endless shopping trips because I was waiting for the big payout. But there is no payout anymore." Chloe let out a wounded gasp, clutching her chest as if he had just physically stabbed her. "You do not mean that?" she sobbed, tears finally streaming down her perfectly contoured face, ruining her expensive makeup. "You love me, Trent. We took vows. I do not love you. Chloe." Trent spat the words out with terrifying venom, completely stripping away the last remaining shreds of his fake affection. "I love money, and right now, you are the most expensive liability in this entire room. You just inherited $60 million in corporate debt, and a massive international logistics company that cannot even dispatch a single delivery truck. You owe a 500% rent increase on a mansion you cannot even afford to heat. You are completely bankrupt." The brutal truth of his words hit Chloe like a physical blow. She slumped forward, resting her head on the mahogany table, and began to weep uncontrollably. It was the deep, ugly sobbing of a woman who had just realized her entire existence was a complete lie. But Trent was not finished panicking. A new, much darker realization suddenly washed over his pale face. He looked at the legal documents on the table, and then looked at his own expensive suit. He was legally married to Chloe. They lived in a community property state. If her corporate shell went bankrupt and the international creditors came knocking, they would not just come after Chloe's assets. They would come after his personal bank accounts too. The invisible shield of his marriage had just transformed into a deadly financial anchor that was about to drag him straight to the bottom of the ocean. Trent began patting down his suit jacket pockets with frantic, jerky movements. He pulled out his cell phone, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped it. He completely ignored his sobbing wife sitting less than 2 feet away from him. He turned his back to the table, pacing frantically toward the far corner of the massive boardroom. He dialed a number, pressing the phone hard against his ear. "Pick up, pick up, pick up," he muttered desperately under his breath, pacing back and forth like a trapped animal. "Hello? David Trent?" practically yelled into the phone the moment the call connected completely, uncaring that everyone in the room could hear every single word. "Yes, it is, Trent. I need your legal advice right now. Do not put me on hold. Listen to me carefully. My wife just acquired a massive amount of toxic corporate debt. I am talking tens of millions in immediate liabilities. I need to know exactly how to shield my personal assets from her legal name immediately. I need to build a financial firewall today before her creditors find my private accounts." Trent gripped his cell phone so tightly his knuckles turned bone white. He paced frantically near the floor-to-ceiling windows, entirely turning his back on his weeping wife. "I do not care what the state community property laws say, David," he hissed aggressively into the receiver. "There has to be a legal loophole. We have only been married for 2 short years." She signed those corporate termination papers completely alone. She acted independently as the sole chief executive officer of the company. That has to count for something in a court of law. I cannot go down with this sinking ship. I have massive personal obligations to settle immediately. The massive boardroom was quiet enough that I could hear the faint, tinny sound of the lawyer's voice leaking through the phone speaker. David was talking rapidly, explaining the brutal, terrifying realities of spousal liability in cases involving massive corporate debt. Trent's face went from pale white to a sickly shade of gray. He stopped pacing, completely frozen in place as the lawyer delivered the final devastating verdict regarding his financial exposure. What do you mean the only way to sever the financial tie is to legally separate? Trent asked, his voice suddenly dropping into a hollow, panicked whisper. You are telling me I have to file the paperwork today to protect myself from her creditors. Fine. Draw up the divorce papers right now. I want emergency filings submitted to the judge before the courthouse closes. Cite whatever you have to cite. Irreconcilable differences. Fraud. Gross financial negligence. I do not care what you write. Just get my name completely detached from hers before the sun goes down today. Trent pulled the phone away from his ear and stared at the dark screen for a long, agonizing second. He pressed the red end call button with a shaking finger. The silence in the boardroom was incredibly heavy, broken only by the continuous sound of Chloe's ragged sobbing. She looked up at him, her expensive mascara running down her cheeks, in thick, dark streaks ruining her perfectly applied makeup. Trent, she whispered, her voice trembling with absolute terror. What are you talking about? Who were you just talking to? What did you just tell David to file at the courthouse? Trent slowly turned around to face her. The frantic panic that had consumed him just a few minutes ago was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating cruelty. He looked at my sister, not as a husband looking at his beloved wife, but as a desperate survivor looking at a diseased limb he needed to immediately amputate to save his own life. He straightened his expensive tailored suit jacket, adjusting his silk collar with stiff, robotic movements. I am filing for divorce, Chloe Trent announced, his voice completely devoid of any emotion or warmth. I am filing for an emergency legal separation effective immediately. The words struck Chloe like a physical blow to the chest. She gasped violently, both of her hands flying up to cover her mouth. No, she cried, shaking her head frantically from side to side. No, Trent, you cannot do this to me. We are a team. You promised me. We are supposed to build this massive empire together. You said we were going to travel the world and live in luxury. You cannot just leave me here to deal with all of this mess by myself. Trent let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed sharply off the mahogany walls. Build an empire? He repeated, mocking her desperate words with pure disgust. There is no empire, Chloe. There is a massive crater of toxic corporate debt, and you are standing right in the absolute center of it. I am not going down into that dark hole with you. I have $15 million in personal underground liabilities to worry about, and I cannot afford to be legally shackled to a woman who just bankrupted a global logistics company in less than 10 minutes because she wanted to act like a boss. Helen scrambled out of her leather chair, her face twisted in fierce maternal outrage. You absolute coward! Helen screamed, pointing a shaking manicured finger directly at Trent. You married my daughter. You took holy vows before God. You pushed her to sign those termination papers, and now you are abandoning her when things get tough. You are a disgusting piece of garbage. Trent did not even blink at the insult. Shut up, Helen, he snapped viciously, walking back toward the center of the room. You and your spoiled, incompetent daughter played right into Zoraya's hands because you were both too incredibly arrogant and lazy to read the fine print of the operating agreement. I am not paying the ultimate price for your sheer stupidity. As of this exact moment, I am entirely legally severing myself from this pathetic, toxic family. Chloe is completely on her own. She can figure out how to pay the 500% rent increase on that giant mansion all by herself. I am packing my bags and leaving the state tonight before the syndicates find me. Trent reached down and grabbed his expensive leather briefcase from the floor next to his chair. He turned his body toward the heavy mahogany doors, eager to escape the suffocating room and the catastrophic mess he had helped create. Chloe leaped out of her chair, her designer heels stumbling clumsily against the plush carpet. She lunged forward desperately, grabbing onto the sleeve of his tailored suit jacket. Trent, please, she begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched wail. Please do not leave me alone. I will fix it. I will talk to Zoraya. I will beg her to reverse the lockdown. Just stay with me, Trent. I need you. I love you so much. Let go of me. Trent snarled, his face twisting into a terrifying mask of pure revulsion. He forcefully yanked his arm backward, trying to break her desperate grip, but Chloe held on tighter, digging her long acrylic fingernails into the expensive fabric of his suit, refusing to let her completely fabricated reality shatter. Trent raised his arm and violently shoved her backward with all of his strength. The physical force of his push sent Chloe stumbling backward across the room. Her high heels gave out from beneath her, and she collapsed onto the floor, landing hard on her knees, right in the middle of the shredded corporate contracts and the pieces of the $10,000 check. She did not try to get back up. She stayed there on her knees, looking up at the man she truly thought was her perfect, wealthy savior. Her chest heaved with violent, uncontrollable sobs. She reached one trembling hand out toward him, silently begging for him to show just one single ounce of mercy. "I told you not to touch me," Trent spat, adjusting his wrinkled sleeve and glaring down at her. "You are absolutely pathetic. Enjoy your bankruptcy." He turned his back on her, completely ignoring her heart-wrenching cries, and stormed out of the boardroom. The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut behind him with a loud, echoing boom, sealing her fate entirely. The room was dead silent again, save for the pathetic sound of my sister weeping on the floor. Helen rushed to Chloe's side, dropping to her knees and wrapping her arms tightly around her sobbing daughter. Helen glared up at me, her eyes full of venom and bitter blame, as if I were the one who had just physically pushed her golden child to the ground. But I did not care about Helen's misdirected anger. I looked down at Chloe, the beautiful golden child who had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate herself. She was kneeling in a pile of shredded paper, stripped of her fake corporate titles abandoned by her opportunistic husband, and completely buried in insurmountable debt. I stood up from my chair, looking down at my sister with absolute clarity. "He did not love you, Chloe," I said, my voice perfectly calm, cutting through her frantic sobbing. "He loved Dad's money. And now you do not have either." I did not wait for my sister to formulate a response to the brutal truth. I simply picked up my encrypted laptop, slid it back into my black leather tote bag, and walked out of the executive suite. The heavy mahogany doors closed behind me, shutting out the pathetic sounds of her weeping and Helen's loud, useless comforting. The corporate lobby was in absolute chaos as I rode the elevator down to the ground floor. Employees were scrambling frantically, trying to understand why their computers had suddenly locked them out of the global network. I walked right past the security desk with my head held high. The same armed guards who had threatened to arrest me earlier this morning now completely ignored me, too busy fielding panicked phone calls from the locked-out international distribution centers to even notice my departure. I pushed through the revolving glass doors and stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. I took a deep breath, letting the sweet taste of total victory fill my lungs. But my work for the day was not quite finished. I got into my car and drove directly toward the affluent suburbs where the massive family estate was located. This mansion was the ultimate symbol of Chloe's golden child status. It was the place where she was endlessly praised, where her bad behavior was constantly rewarded, and where I was treated like an invisible servant. While I drove, I used my secure mobile hotspot to access the smart home security system of the estate. My father had insisted on top-of-the-line automation, and I was the one who had programmed the administrative backend. With a few quick taps on my screen, I completely wiped Chloe's biometric access data. I deactivated her key fobs, disabled her personalized gate codes, turned off the perimeter security cameras that she controlled, and electronically locked down every single exterior door. The physical keys she carried in her expensive designer purse were now absolutely useless. By the time I pulled my car through the towering wrought iron gates, the entire property was entirely under my strict digital control. I parked my sedan in the circular driveway and made a quick phone call to the local police precinct. I informed the dispatcher that I was the legal owner of the property and that I was expecting a hostile individual to arrive shortly who had previously demonstrated highly erratic behavior. Because of the wealthy neighborhood, the police response time was incredibly fast. Within 15 minutes, a black and white patrol cruiser rolled quietly up the long driveway. Two uniformed officers stepped out, looking around the manicured green lawns with mild curiosity. I met them on the massive stone porch, holding the official state registry folder in my hands. I calmly introduced myself as the Chief Executive Officer of Phoenix Holdings and presented them with the original deed to the land and the estate. They reviewed the documents carefully, verifying my absolute legal ownership of the entire property. I asked them to stand by in case of a disturbance, and they politely agreed, waiting quietly in the shadows of the grand white columns. We did not have to wait very long. Less than half an hour later, a sleek black luxury rideshare vehicle sped up the long driveway and came to a screeching, halting stop near the fountain. The rear door flew open, and Chloe stumbled out. She looked absolutely horrific. Her expensive runway dress was wrinkled and stained. Her hair was a tangled mess, and her face was streaked with dark, ruined makeup. She had clearly been abandoned by Helen, who was probably busy calling her own lawyers to protect her own assets, and had taken a car straight to the only place she thought she still had any power. She wanted to retreat into her luxurious fortress to hide from the massive, crushing reality of her bankruptcy. She marched up the front steps, entirely ignoring the police cruiser parked just a few yards away in her blind, self-absorbed panic. Chloe reached the heavy oak front doors and frantically dug through her oversized tote bag. She pulled out her heavy ring of keys and jammed the primary key into the brass deadbolt. She twisted it hard, but the electronic locking mechanism refused to engage. The small light above the handle flashed a solid, angry red. She let out a frustrated growl and yanked the key out, trying her digital fob instead. She tapped the plastic sensor against the security pad over and over again. Access denied. Access denied. The automated voice of the security system calmly rejected her every single time. "Open the door!" she screamed, slamming her bare hands against the thick wood. "Let me in right now. I demand you let me in." I stepped out from the shadows of the massive stone columns, the two police officers falling in right behind me. "Are you having some trouble with the locks, Chloe?" I asked, my voice echoing loudly across the quiet, affluent neighborhood. Chloe spun around violently, pressing her back against the door. She stared at me, her eyes wide and bloodshot, her chest heaving with exhaustion. "What are you doing here?" she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Get off my property, Zariah. This is my house. Daddy left this house to me. I will have you arrested for breaking in." I stopped at the top of the stairs, looking down at her pathetic, desperate display. "You really do not listen, do you, Chloe?" I said, shaking my head slowly. "I told you very clearly in the boardroom. You own the physical house, but Phoenix Holdings owns the dirt it sits on. And since your corporate shell just defaulted on the 500% rent increase, your residential lease is officially terminated. You do not live here anymore." Chloe opened her mouth to scream another insult, but the two police officers stepped forward, placing themselves firmly between us. "Ma'am, you need to step away from the door," the taller officer instructed, his voice carrying strict professional authority. "This property belongs to Phoenix Holdings, and the owner has requested that you vacate the premises immediately." Chloe looked at the officers in sheer disbelief. "No," she gasped, gripping the brass door handle tightly. "You cannot do this. She is the one breaking the law. I have a restraining order against her. I gave it to her yesterday at the cemetery. She is not allowed to be anywhere near me. Arrest her right now." I smiled a genuine warm smile, reaching into the inside pocket of my crimson suit jacket. I pulled out the exact same folded piece of white paper she had aggressively shoved into my chest just 24 hours ago. I unfolded the restraining order and calmly handed it directly to the taller police officer. "You are absolutely right, Chloe," I said, my voice dripping with cold satisfaction. "You do have a restraining order that prevents me from coming within 500 feet of you." I looked at the officer and gestured toward my trembling sister. "Officers, this woman is actively violating a court order by trespassing on my private property." The taller officer looked down at the piece of paper in his hand and then back up at my sister. He read the specific stipulations printed clearly on the court document, taking his time to process the legal jargon. The text explicitly stated that the two of us were legally mandated to remain 500 feet apart at all times to prevent any further emotional distress. The officer then looked down at the official state property deed I had provided him earlier. The legal reality of the situation immediately clicked into place in his mind. "Mom," he said, turning to face Chloe with a stern, uncompromising expression. "This document clearly states that you filed a restraining order against Zariah. However, since Zariah is the verified legal owner of this entire estate, and you are currently standing on her front porch, you are the individual actively violating the boundaries of the court order. You are legally required to vacate this property right now." Chloe stared at the police officer, as if he had just started speaking an entirely different language. She shook her head violently, her tangled blonde hair whipping around her tear-stained face. "No, you are not listening to me," she screamed, her voice shrill and desperate, echoing loudly off the stone pillars. "This is my house. My father left this house to me. Look at the primary will. Call my lawyer immediately. She is playing some kind of twisted illegal trick on me. She does not own anything. I am the eldest daughter, and I am the only one who belongs here." The second officer stepped forward, resting his hand casually on his utility belt, a clear warning for her to calm down. "Mom, we have already reviewed the verified property deeds." He explained, his voice perfectly calm, but carrying an absolute finality. "Phoenix Holdings owns this estate, and this woman is the legal representative of that company. You do not have a valid residential lease to be here. We are not going to argue about complex probate law on the front porch. You need to turn around, walk back to your hired car, and leave the premises immediately. If you refuse to leave, we will be forced to physically remove you for criminal trespassing and violating your own civil order." The sheer impossibility of the situation finally crashed down onto Chloe's shoulders. Just 72 hours ago, she had stood inside this exact same foyer, wearing a designer dress, while her entitled husband laughed and handed me a pathetic $10,000 check to disappear. She had ordered me out of my own childhood home into the freezing rain while my father was not even in the ground yet. She had felt so incredibly powerful. Now the universe had brutally snapped the scales of justice back into perfect alignment. She was the one standing in the cold, begging for a place to stay, while I stood firmly in the warm, golden light of the doorway, completely untouchable. "I am not leaving," Chloe shrieked, stomping her expensive designer heel against the stone porch like a spoiled toddler throwing a massive tantrum. "You cannot make me leave my own house. I will call the mayor. I know the chief of police. I play tennis with his wife at the country club every single weekend. You two are going to lose your jobs for disrespecting me like this." The taller officer sighed heavily, clearly losing his patience with her absurd sense of entitlement. He reached out and firmly grasped her upper arm, attempting to guide her away from the heavy oak door. "Let us go, ma'am," he ordered. "You have been given a lawful command to vacate the property. Do not touch me." Chloe completely lost her mind. She violently yanked her arm away from the officer, her heavy, oversized designer tote bag swinging wildly and striking the second officer squarely in the chest. She began thrashing and screaming at the top of her lungs, completely abandoning any remaining shred of her fake high society dignity. "This is my house. You are ruining my life, Zariah. I hate you. I hate you so much. Give me back my company right now." Her piercing screams echoed loudly across the quiet, manicured lawns of the affluent neighborhood. Across the street, the heavy mahogany front door of the Jenkins residence slowly opened. Mrs. Jenkins, a wealthy socialite who frequently attended Chloe's lavish dinner parties, stepped out onto her porch, pulling her cashmere cardigan tight around her shoulders. Next door, the retired cardiovascular surgeon stopped watering his perfectly trimmed rose bushes and stared openly at the chaotic scene unfolding in my driveway. Chloe suddenly realized she had an audience. She stopped thrashing for a fraction of a second, her wide, panicked eyes darting toward the neighboring houses. The people she had spent her entire adult life desperately trying to impress were now standing on their pristine lawns, watching her behave like an absolute lunatic. She was being publicly humiliated in front of the exact same elite country club peers she considered her true equals. But instead of calming down the intense public shame, pushed her completely over the edge. She let out a guttural, animalistic scream and lunged forward, trying to push past the officers to physically attack me. She swung her arms wildly, her long acrylic nails aiming right for my face. I did not even flinch. I just stood perfectly still on my porch and watched the inevitable consequences of her actions finally catch up to her. The officers moved with practiced speed and absolute efficiency. They grabbed both of her flailing arms, twisting her around and forcing her face down against the cold, hard hood of their black and white patrol cruiser. Chloe kicked her legs wildly, her designer dress riding up her thighs as she sobbed and screamed incoherently. The sharp, metallic clicking sound of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting shut around her wrists echoed clearly over her pathetic wailing. "You are under arrest for assaulting a police officer, trespassing and resisting arrest," the taller officer announced, completely unbothered by her continuous screaming. He pushed her head down firmly and guided her into the back seat of the police cruiser, slamming the heavy metal door shut. Her muffled cries could still be heard through the thick safety glass, but she was finally entirely contained. The officer walked back up to the porch, handing me his business card. "Sorry for the disturbance, Mom," he said, tipping his hat respectfully. "We will process her down at the main precinct. You have a quiet evening." "Thank you, officers," I replied smoothly. "I appreciate your swift assistance." I stood on the stone porch and watched the patrol cruiser slowly back out of my driveway, its red and blue lights flashing silently against the encroaching twilight. The neighbors lingered for a few more moments, whispering eagerly to each other, before quietly retreating back into their massive, expensive homes. The entire neighborhood would be talking about the spectacular downfall of the golden child by tomorrow morning. Her reputation was as completely destroyed as her bank account. I turned around and walked back inside the grand foyer, closing the heavy oak front door and locking it securely behind me. The house was completely silent. The chaotic, toxic energy that had suffocated these halls for my entire life was finally gone forever. I walked slowly past the grand staircase and stepped into my father's private study. The room smelled faintly of old leather books and expensive wood polish. I walked over to the antique mahogany liquor cabinet sitting in the corner. Sitting right on top of the polished wood was the exact same heavy crystal glass Trent had used on night one to celebrate my midnight eviction. I picked up the heavy crystal, feeling its cool, solid weight in my hand. I reached for the vintage bottle of my father's most expensive bourbon, the very same bottle Trent had arrogantly poured from. I poured a generous measure of the dark amber liquid, watching it swirl smoothly against the intricate cuts of the crystal glass. I raised the glass in a silent toast to the empty room, taking a slow, quiet sip and letting the warm, satisfying burn slide down my throat. 3 months passed since that quiet toast in my father's study. The bitter chill of winter had melted into a bright, promising spring. I was sitting behind the massive mahogany desk in the executive suite of Phoenix Holdings, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows at the sprawling city skyline. The transition had been brutal but incredibly necessary. I had completely dissolved the toxic corporate shell my sister inherited and seamlessly integrated the physical logistics fleet directly into my holding company. I reinstated every single employee who had been wrongfully terminated during Chloe's 10-minute reign of terror. I gave the warehouse managers substantial raises and upgraded our global tracking software to handle new massive international accounts. The company was not just surviving, it was thriving with record-breaking quarterly profits. The boardroom was no longer a place of arrogant hostility. It was filled with loyal, brilliant minds who actually understood the grueling work required to build an empire. I had finally built the legacy my father always knew I could, without any of the dead weight dragging me down. That dead weight was currently being crushed under the heavy, unyielding wheels of the federal justice system. Trent's grand escape plan had failed miserably. Richard Vance had made good on every single one of his threats. He unleashed a small army of ruthless corporate attorneys who immediately filed massive civil fraud lawsuits against Trent, freezing his bank accounts and seizing his passport before he could flee the country. But the civil courts were the absolute least of his problems. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had opened a massive criminal inquiry into his unauthorized attempt to liquidate $60 million of corporate assets across state lines. He was currently under federal indictment, facing multiple charges of wire fraud, attempted embezzlement, and corporate espionage, carrying a maximum sentence of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. And even worse, the underground gambling syndicates had managed to track him down to a cheap rental apartment before the feds brought him in. Rumor had it that Trent showed up to his first federal court hearing with a broken jaw and 2 fractured ribs. He was completely ruined, stripped of his tailored suits and his arrogant white privilege, locked in a concrete cell where his manipulation tactics were completely useless. My sister had not fared much better. The magnificent golden child, who had spent her entire life demanding luxury and looking down on everyone else, was now living in a run-down motel right off the interstate highway. Without Trent's income and burdened by the massive debt from her catastrophic breach of contract, Chloe was completely destitute. The luxury mansion had been formally repossessed by Phoenix Holdings, and her designer wardrobe had been sold off piece by piece just to pay her mounting legal fees. Her wealthy country club friends, the people she valued above her own blood, had entirely abandoned her the second her bank accounts hit zero. My cell phone vibrated on the polished mahogany desk, pulling me away from my quarterly financial reports. The caller identification displayed a restricted number. I knew exactly who it was. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. A minute later, the notification popped up. I tapped the screen and put the audio on speaker. Chloe's voice filled the quiet executive office. She was sobbing uncontrollably, the sound raw and incredibly desperate. "Zariah, please," she begged, her voice trembling violently. "Please pick up the phone. I have absolutely nothing left. The motel manager is kicking me out tomorrow morning because my credit card declined. The room smells like mold and I am so cold. I have not eaten a real meal in 2 days. Nobody will answer my calls. Please, Zariah. I know we had our differences, but we are still sisters. I am so sorry for everything. Just loan me $5,000, even $2,000. I will pay you back, I swear. Please do not leave me out here to die." I listened to the entire 2-minute voicemail, staring at the glowing screen of my phone. A year ago, hearing my sister cry like that would have broken my heart. I would have rushed to rescue her. But now I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no pity, just a profound sense of quiet peace. She was not apologizing for her cruelty. She was apologizing because she had finally run out of victims to manipulate. I reached out and tapped the red trash can icon, permanently deleting the voicemail. Then I opened my settings and permanently blocked the restricted number. Total, absolute no contact. She was no longer my problem. Just as I set my phone back down, the intercom on my desk buzzed loudly. It was my executive assistant. "Miss Zariah," she said, her voice laced with obvious tension. "Your stepmother Helen is down in the main lobby. She is causing quite a scene and demanding to speak with you immediately. She bypassed the security turnstiles and is screaming that it is a matter of life and death." I leaned back in my chair, smoothing down the lapels of my tailored navy suit. "Send her up to the executive reception area," I instructed calmly. "And please have Marcus from security meet her there immediately." I walked out of my office and stepped into the plush reception area just as the elevator doors slid open. Helen practically fell out of the elevator. She looked terrible. Her expensive salon blonde hair was showing 2 inches of gray roots, and she was wearing a simple wrinkled blouse that she clearly had not ironed. She rushed toward me, reaching out to grab my arms, but Marcus, the large security guard who had been forced to escort me out of the building 3 months ago, quickly stepped between us, blocking her path. Helen recoiled, her hands clasped together in a desperate, pleading gesture. "Zariah, thank God," she cried out, tears welling in her eyes. "You have to help us. Chloe is practically living on the streets. You have to give her a job or a loan. You won the war. You proved your point and you took the entire company. Now please show some grace and help your family." I looked at the woman who had stood in the boardroom and cheered while my sister tried to throw me out onto the street without a severance package. I looked at the woman who had called me on the phone and ordered me to bow down to an entitled parasite who was actively stealing my father's legacy. "You do not have a family here, Helen," I said, my voice cold and hard as steel. "You gambled everything on the wrong child and you lost." I looked at Marcus, who gave me a firm nod of respect. "Marcus," I said clearly, "this woman is trespassing on corporate property. Please escort her out of the building right now, and if she ever comes back, call the police." Helen gasped, her face turning bright red with outrage and humiliation as Marcus firmly grabbed her arm. "You cannot do this," she shrieked, struggling against his strong grip. "I am your father's wife. You owe me respect." I turned my back on her, walking slowly back toward my massive corner office. "I do not owe you anything," I called over my shoulder, as her desperate screaming was completely muffled by the heavy closing elevator doors. I walked back down the long corridor toward my corner office. The heavy silence that settled over the executive floor was entirely different from the oppressive tension that used to choke these hallways. It was a clean, peaceful silence, the kind of quiet that only comes after a massive, violent storm has finally broken and the air is left completely clear. I passed by the glass-walled conference rooms where my newly appointed logistics directors were busy holding productive strategy meetings. There were no more raised voices. There were no more arrogant threats or whispered insults. The people sitting in those rooms were there because of their brilliant minds and their dedication to the company, not because they married into the right family or threw the loudest tantrums. They looked up as I walked past, offering genuine, respectful smiles. I nodded back, feeling a deep sense of pride swell in my chest. This was what a real corporate empire was supposed to look like. I stepped inside my office and softly closed the heavy wooden door behind me. The late afternoon sun was beginning its slow descent, casting a warm, golden glow across the room. I walked over to the massive mahogany desk that used to belong to my father and slowly lowered myself into the heavy leather chief executive officer chair. It fit me perfectly. I swiveled the chair around to face the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. Before me, the sprawling Boston skyline stretched out in every direction. The tall glass skyscrapers caught the fading sunlight, reflecting brilliant shades of amber and deep purple. Down below in the busy streets, I could just barely make out the distant shape of one of our company delivery trucks navigating through the heavy city traffic. That single truck was a tiny piece of the massive global network that I had fought so incredibly hard to protect. I sat there in the quiet warmth of the office and allowed myself a moment of absolute vulnerability. The truth was that dismantling my own family had not been a joyful experience. Despite the cold satisfaction of watching my sister and her arrogant husband completely destroy themselves, there was still a deep, lingering ache in my chest. It was the heavy grief of mourning a family I never actually had. I spent my entire life desperately hoping that one day my sister would finally look at me with genuine respect. I hoped my stepmother would eventually show me an ounce of real maternal warmth. I hoped we could all sit around a Thanksgiving dinner table without the bitter taste of jealousy and toxic competition ruining the meal. But that version of my family was nothing but a complete fantasy. The people I shared a bloodline with were never going to change. They were emotional vampires who viewed my success as a personal insult and my hard work as an endless resource for them to exploit. Accepting that brutal reality was the hardest thing I had ever done. Cutting them out of my life permanently felt like amputating a limb without any anesthesia. It was agonizing and bloody, and it left a permanent scar. But I also knew with absolute certainty that if I had not severed those ties, the infection of their endless greed would have eventually killed me. They would have drained my bank accounts, destroyed my career, and left me with absolutely nothing. I had to choose between my own survival and their toxic comfort. I chose myself. I chose my future. I chose to protect the hundreds of innocent employees who relied on this company to feed their families. I traded the miserable illusion of family loyalty for the absolute reality of my own hard-earned peace. I looked down at the smooth, polished wood of the mahogany desk, running my fingertips over the intricate grain. My father was a complicated man. He was harsh, demanding, and often emotionally distant. But as I sat in his chair, looking out over the empire he built, I finally understood the brutal brilliance of his final lesson. He knew exactly what Chloe and Trent were capable of. He knew that if he simply handed me the entire company on a silver platter, they would have spent the rest of their miserable lives dragging me through endless, expensive court battles trying to steal it back. They would have painted themselves as poor, helpless victims, and me as the greedy, manipulative sister. So instead of giving me the keys to the kingdom, he gave Chloe the keys to a completely empty shell. He gave them exactly enough rope to hang themselves. My father forced me to be the one to pull the trigger. He made me step out of the shadows and claim my own power. He knew that true authority cannot be inherited. It has to be taken. It has to be defended. By setting up the blind trust and making me the sole owner of Phoenix Holdings, he forced me to stop playing the role of the quiet, obedient scapegoat. He taught me that the only way to deal with leeches is to completely remove their food source. It was a terrifying, traumatic lesson, but it was the only way to guarantee my permanent survival. He gave me the ultimate weapon, and he trusted me to have the strength to use it. I turned my chair back around to face the room. The shadows were growing longer, but my office felt incredibly bright. I opened my encrypted laptop and looked at the live global tracking map. Thousands of green dots were moving smoothly across the screen, representing a healthy, thriving international network. We were expanding into new European markets next quarter without Trent's disastrous interference. The emergency reserve fund was fully replenished, ensuring that every single warehouse worker would receive their holiday bonus this year. The legacy my father envisioned was no longer suffocated by the endless demands of entitled people who refused to work for their privileges. I had completely cleansed the foundation. Every single morning when I walk through those glass revolving doors, I know that I earned my place at the absolute pinnacle of this industry. The company was completely secure. My future was completely secure. The war was officially over, and I was the undisputed victor, standing on top of the mountain I had built with my own 2 hands. Blood does not make you family, loyalty does. Have you ever had to let a toxic family member destroy themselves? Tell me in the comments. And if you are the scapegoat of your family, remember, sometimes you have to burn the table down to build your own. The story of Zaraya teaches us a profound truth about family dynamics. We are conditioned by society to believe that blood relations demand unconditional loyalty, even when that same blood continuously disrespects our boundaries and drains our emotional resources. Zaraya spent years trying to earn the respect of her sister and stepmother, supporting a family that viewed her as a disposable utility. The most vital lesson here is that you cannot heal a toxic environment by sacrificing your own well-being. True family is defined by mutual respect, shared loyalty, and the consistent choice to uplift one another. When people use your shared history as a weapon to manipulate or demean you, they forfeit the privilege of your presence. Zaraya had to make the agonizing choice to dismantle the fragile illusion of her family to protect her father's legacy and her future. She realized that holding on to toxic relatives was like investing in a bankrupt company. Sometimes the most powerful act of self-preservation is walking away from the very people who should have protected you. It takes immense courage to stop playing the designated role of the family scapegoat and firmly demand the respect you actually deserve. By decisively cutting off the emotional vampires in her life, Zaraya created the necessary space for a much healthier and far more authentic existence. We must learn to evaluate our relationships based on how people treat us in the present moment, rather than the familial titles they were born into. You absolutely do not owe anyone your sanity or your success just because you happen to share a last name. If you are currently carrying the suffocating burden of a toxic family dynamic, Take a step back today to establish your boundaries and remember that choosing your peace is never a selfish act.